only esports odds matrix, because that's like the new way to say it. Essentially, as the episode goes on, I won't make these guys sit here for it all. Some of it I'll do in post, etc. You'll just see me on the different segments talk about what games are coming up or basic predictions, or we'll use it as a way to start a topic which then becomes whatever would be the topic anywhere in a talk show. So what I did is I structured this one a little bit, which is obviously now we've got all the big leagues starting up. When we did the first episode, it was basically only like the Superliga, which is obviously the ERL, like LVP, etc. Like, I know most people don't really follow those, so I briefly referenced them, but I didn't try to make my co-hosts like talk about some games they wouldn't know the players of. But obviously now that the big regions in theory are starting, and obviously the big dog of the LCS has begun, right? What I thought we'd do is this. I'll start out by just mentioning, I looked up the matches that there's going to be, because I should be able to get this episode out before most of the first ones, but obviously the whole weekend there'll be games played. Like, I've got a couple right now that I thought were interesting, which is one was TSM plays against Evil Geniuses, and even though on paper people will think, oh, it's TSM, they're brilliant, blah, blah, blah. If you ever saw that EG lineup, like, they actually have some pretty good players. I don't know that it was a very well put together team. Like, I'm actually a bit surprised that Peter Don was involved with that team, because, like, to me, some of the players are a mismatch, but I do think in general they have some good players on that team. And if you saw last split, that was one of those teams where, like, they weren't really in the mix to be a contender, but they did surprisingly, like, they were one of the few teams that was like a mid-table team that could almost beat and lose to anyone. Like, which I just find, by the way, if you want to have what in English we say a flotter, like if you want to gamble, but the idea is you're not doing it because you know this team's going to win or you don't have some extra special info. The other fun one to go on is one where it just gives you what you call a sweat, right? You just think you don't know who's going to win this match. So I actually thought, since they're playing against TSM in this game, and they're obviously the underdog in terms of the odds, actually, if you wanted to pick one where it'll make the game in theory a bit more tense and there is a chance that TSM just loses, I think there's another thing, by the way. I can just build in my own bias. Obviously, fuck TSM, so any chance that they might lose, I've got to believe it's possible. So I'm personally, as you'll probably see on the screen, I'm going to basically going to pick EG to win that one. And then another one, similar take, was I saw that Dignitas is playing as FlyQuest. And even though FlyQuest, if people don't know, is that team that's like a mixture of like bizarre like South American imports and then like players you've just never heard of, basically. And they tried to go like a different route. I guess it was before the whole Oceanic thing. They were trying to get like players that you might not expect would be good, but could be LCS level. And if people don't know, again, last split, Dignitas was basically like actually one of the higher ranked teams. I think they finished like fourth or something, bizarrely, despite they've got like an all NA roster. But if you have a look at these two squads, like Dignitas wasn't actually that good a team, I have to say. A lot of their games, I don't know how they were winning. So I personally think, again, I looked on this one, FlyQuest's a fairly big underdog. So actually, I think for this one, again, if you want to go with the underdog, you want to take like not the favourite, it's probably a decent chance. Right, so I thought an LCS-related topic that we could now segue seamlessly into as always some sort of a professional is, in the LCS, the team that won the last split was obviously Cloud9, this team that had all the big perk signing and then the whole gamble of fudge and blah, blah, blah. And they went to MSI. This year there was one. And obviously they underwhelmed because they didn't make it to the playoffs. And let's be real, if you are from any of the classic four regions, because I have to say, I know LMS isn't a region anymore, but fucking hell, their team is still better than LCS most times. So I know that's not classically a region, but if you think of the big four, right, one of the reasons I actually kind of have come round to Dom's perspective that MSI isn't actually that good a tournament is, bear in mind, there's only one team from each of those major four regions. The minimum should be making top four. Like, if you're from the LEC, you should, like, celebrate. Like, I made the semis. It's like, what the fuck was the alternative? What, that some team from, like, fucking Turkey made it over you? Like, that's not the same vibe as, like, I made out of groups at Worlds. At Worlds, there might be, like, three... I mean, now there's going to be 4 LCK and 4 LPL teams. That is an achievement to make it out of groups, potentially. Even then, it depends what group you're in. So, basically, right, the thing I've noticed is... all the discussion going into MSI was stuff like, will perks fail? Oh, is Fudge going to be good in the tournament or whatever? But because of the way it ended and the fact that the tournament, like, actually they sort of shit the bed in some of the key moments, it then just became about things like classic narrative. Is Sven a choker? Does he just, collapse at certain times? Obviously, the whole blabber thing, because he'd be the MVP, people heavily focused on. So it led to this scenario where when they came home, even though I would think the logical thing it would be is you just run it back. You take the same lineup, you go to the next split, you see how it does. You take the experience from MSI, you go to Worlds with it. Instead, Cloud9, bizarrely, has chosen to actually bench Sven, which I find very bizarre, because if people don't know, one of the other factors behind their Fudge signing, it's actually what me and Rich talked about on that episode of Thorin's Rotations at the end of the off-season, is that potentially they were also making that move. This is where fans don't think ahead like a general manager. They were also potentially doing that move a bit cynically, because when Sven becomes a resident, now you can also potentially just replace the Fudge guy with another import. You could just have 5 import. I mean, I know Vulcan technically isn't import yet, but eventually you could go to a 5 import lineup essentially, which, if you notice, a lot of the big orgs in America have at least left the door open for that. They've at least like sort of half planned that they can maneuver that way. So now this move happens where you would think Sven must be part of the long-term plans, because that's why you've had him the last couple of years. Apparently now he is benched. As a result, will be an academy player. They bring in this player called King, who obviously no one watches academy in America. No one really knows who this guy is. He's obviously like a guy they're trying to test out. And it's led to all this potential discussions. There's a million angles we can go with on this, Rich. So I want to get your thoughts first. Basically, this could either be specific to him and what you think about him as a player, the case. Obviously, it can be about things like, I saw Doublelift on his stream. This is part of why people are discussing it. Basically brought it up where he was trying to flex on the angle of like, you're in contract prison. And he was even trying to do this weird thing where he was sort of like trying to make it seem really predatory that like the team owners have people on contract, but then don't just let them go to whatever team they want. So bizarrely, Doublelift essentially is a Fnatic fan saying that, you know, Perk should just be allowed to go to their team even if you have it on contract. So whatever. There's that angle. There's obviously, I know you work obviously like as an agent, so there's the whole thing of like, we can talk about things like what happens when you get benched, etc. So where do you want to start here, Rich? What's the initial thing that appeals to you about this topic?
Yeah, so I think I'll give my initial thought and then kind of address that Doublelift angle. So my initial thought is that I'm surprised, I'm a little confused, and I'm actually kind of interested. This is one of those things where it's like, you know, if you do a reflections with Sven in like a few years' time, I'd be really interested to see what actually happened, because Sven as a person, incredibly amicable, very nice, like no history of not getting on with teammates or anything like that. So I'm kind of ruling out a default angle of this guy's toxic and bad for team environment, right? Like in my opinion, unless something very specific happened which could have prompted some kind of response like that, I kind of rule that out in my head as a possibility. Then obviously you look at the performance side. Was Sven like exemplary at MSI? No, definitely not. Was he like the worst performer? I don't think so. And are you upgrading him by replacing him with King? I would be, you know, lying if I said I knew much about King. But I think on the face of it, it seems like a strange move to me, and I wonder what the motivations are behind it. And I'm thinking maybe this is just my best guess, that maybe they're like going for this thing they kind of did with Sneaky a while back, where it's like they're benching him in the hope that he'll become like reinvigorated and motivated or something. Like maybe it's like one of these psychological angles. That's what I initially went to. In sort of addressing what Doublelift said about, you know, contract jail and all the rest of it. I think, you know, there was a time, particularly in other esports, to be honest, but also to a certain extent in League, where players were essentially preyed on. And does it still happen? Yeah, absolutely. Is it super regular in the big Western orgs that players just get completely like smashed around and dumped on? No, not really, to be honest. Usually, you know, first of all, most players have some kind of representation these days when they sign, whether that be like a legal expert specifically or whether it be an agent. And even though, you know, I'm sure there are people who malpractice to a certain extent, usually it's not in the agent or the lawyer's interest, especially to like screw the guy over in contract negotiations, right? And there are lots of, you know, what some would call like fall clauses, or, you know, basically sub/ACAD clauses, where if a player gets benched, it's not like this guy just loses, you know, 3/4 of his salary and everything else. Like this guy will still be getting paid pretty well, I'm sure, on Cloud9 relative to what he was already being paid. In terms of, you know, what you alluded to, like, oh, this guy, you know, if he wants to leave, he should be allowed to leave. This is what I would call like a fan argument, and it's essentially just goes back to sort of their general ethos of we are more fans of the player than we are the team, which I think is still the case. And I want what's best for my Weibo pillow cutout player that I've attached myself to. He should be allowed to do whatever he wants, which is complete nonsense. And esports would collapse as a business if the players were literally allowed to come and go as they please. So yeah, I think overall I'm surprised. As I said, if I had to guess, I would guess that Sven will be back in the starting lineup at some point during the split. Maybe that's slightly unfair to King, and I am ignorant when it comes to speaking about King. I don't know anything about the guy, but my guess would be that he's back. And in terms of, do I believe that this guy's been screwed over by Cloud9? No, I don't think so. And I'm kind of interested by the move, because, you know, one thing I've always respected about certain organizations like G2, for example, is that they won the split, right? Sure, they didn't have the best performance at MSI, but I think it's really I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's somewhat brave to make changes when you are the winning team in your region, rather than just to sit on what you've done and be like, well, we won last time, so we're just going to run it back and hopefully it will go well. That's safe. That wouldn't ruffle any feathers. Obviously, this did ruffle feathers, but at the same time, I don't know what the merits are behind the decision, but I like that Cloud9 historically has not been afraid to make changes, even if it upsets fans.
Right, Wickd, obviously, again, there's a load of angles on this one, but like, do you have any that springs out to you? I can craft one for you, like the obvious pro angle to me.
Stuff.
Yeah, go on.
From my perspective, like Rich said that Sven wasn't performing that well at MSI, right? From my perspective as a player, I feel like the bot lane of C9 was performing extremely well. I would even put them as the second best bot lane in MSI. Besides RNG's bot lane, they were way too good, right? And the thing is, this doesn't make any sense to me that they're changing him out, because I feel like he's a hard worker. He's been top of the ladder the whole time. Unless there's some drastic problems in the team that he's a part of, it doesn't make any sense to me, because so the problem is, like, C9 team is super good right now. And I think at MSI, the only reason it didn't make it was because of small problems in the team and not in the individual players. And Sven was one of the best performing players on that team together with Vulcan in my eyes. It was more so other players in that team that were making those mistakes from what I could see. And then changing a player after that, it doesn't make any sense. I would like to hear much more from Cloud9 on why this actually happened, which we probably won't. One thing I could see, they said they wanted him to lead the academy team, which I guess maybe they wanted to boost up the academy team. That could be an angle to look at, because that would make a lot of sense, because he's been in the scene for a long time. He got a lot of experience, and I know he's very vocal, which is obviously good for a newer team, or an academy team.
I have a lot of problems with this type of move, because here's the problem, right? I'll set it up initially as like a nuanced take, because the issue I have is this, right? It is true on almost every talk show, because even if they say a reason why, even if the player does an interview, you can never really trust how much of that's true or how much is, what they want the public to believe about the move, etc. The problem is we can never really know internally what the issue is. Like, the classic example would be, even if you hear someone's like a bit toxic, you don't know how bad that is. Like, if they really are having like fucking Forgiven type scenarios where they're just like basically chewing people out like directly to their face and stuff, well then in that scenario, yeah, it might be inappropriate on the show. We just talk about what we see with our eyes in the server, like, well, this guy, Forgiven, is better than him or whatever. It's like, maybe that's not the issue you're trying to solve for there. So I will say there are obviously extenuating circumstances where personal things go on, or people literally have arguments and like personality clashes where you can't, there's an impasse you cannot get past. The problem is, obviously, I can only look from like the game performance side, and that's one area where I always find this very whack, because even though I appreciate, like you said there, Rich, basically what Cloud9 did in Season 8, where they benched a bunch of the big names, obviously Sneaky and Jensen were the two most notable ones, and then the idea was, through a mixture of having good enough results with the subs, they were able to sort of potentially rehabilitate where those guys were at, like attitude-wise, or, how they fit into the team, or maybe they just didn't pull rank, because they were kind of the superstar names before. I get that that's a factor, but the problem I have with this scenario is that at least makes sense, because in that kind of a scenario, assuming it's true, you always eventually do intend to reinstate the real player that you did sign to play for your team. The angle I don't get is this sort of a move by, like, things that we could say there, like the angle that they're moving him to, he's going to lead the academy squad. That almost makes it sound like for some reason they're just moving away from this player, and potentially they really believe this other guy, even if it's temporarily, should be the replacement. That's the angle I've never really understood. Because let's be real, one thing about esports that does not in any way translate to real sports, and we just have to go through this in CSGO, is all subs and sixth men and academy players in general are not on the level of the real starters of your team. This isn't like fucking where like Manchester City can bring in some other amazing international level player to replace like a winger that they take out of this game now, and therefore if that winger acts up or if he's just not playing well, yeah, you would consider replacing him. Like, in real sports, that is a thing. In esports, and particularly in games like League and CSGO, where it is basically about the 5 players you sign, and the rest are just a different factor, like for the future, or you want to sell them or whatever. Like, I don't really buy that angle, because what they always try to do, Rich, is like, they always make it like the idea. They always pretend in the press release, like, but this guy's got all this talent and potential. It's like, yeah, but he's not Sven, is he? Like, if he was, let's be real, what are the odds you'd have him on your academy team? Wouldn't he be on someone else? Would he only be Dignitas as starting, AD carry or something like? I've always found that part. It feels like the team orgs, they sort of like push the bullshit angle a bit too far. And I don't really buy that they believe any of these academy players, beyond rare examples where they're like 15 now or something, they're too young. I don't think any of them really believe that the players can replace the starters.
So there's one like small aspect I guess, which doesn't, get talked about too much, which is you also have to factor in factor in the academy team staff, right? And there's this strange dichotomy where they want to do well and perform. They want their academy team to perform well. I can tell you that I'm pretty sure most orgs don't care as much about the actual overall team performance of the academy team as the individual head coach for that team will, right? It's usually, but also this guy wants to keep his players because he wants to perform well, and that makes him look better as a coach. But also it makes him look better as a coach when players get, instated into the main team from the academy team, right? So I don't think we should necessarily underestimate or at least rule out the possibility that this guy's being pushed perpetually by his academy team coach. Like, trust me, this AD carry is really good. If this guy just had his chance, blah, blah, blah. And not every team scrims in the same ways, right? Like a lot of organizations, they'll scrim their own academy team like multiple times a week. Some teams won't do it whatsoever because remember this whole thing of like, I don't want to scrim against someone who could potentially replace, me and my job, blah, blah, blah. And that's particularly prevalent in North America, right? So it could be the case that the academy coach literally thinks this guy's fire. And if there's been even like, I don't know, a small issue or they felt like a dip in performance or something like that, if they've constantly got this guy in the team's ear of like, trust me, this guy's really, really good and pushing this player, he might be pushed beyond his actual means as a player. I'm not saying that Jack would have caved to that necessarily. I'm just saying that this could be a factor as well, that maybe he's actually, a scrim god and the academy team's been like pushing for this guy to get starting position. And as ultimately as well, we don't know what the reasoning is or how permanent this move is. It could literally be the case that this guy is out of the starting lineup for the first couple of weeks and then immediately comes back in. We don't know, right? I think it's worth noting that if you were fully promoting a player, and you were feeling very confident that this guy was going to be the starting player for the whole season or whatever, you would probably do some kind of promotional piece on that player. I would actually think that would be like
during the last split or something.
Right, yeah. And that didn't really happen. Yeah. It was just Jack in front of a cam, sort of ad hoc style. So my guess, as I said, is that Sven will be back midsummer would be my guess.
Okay. Yeah, I'll assume the same. I'd actually assume he's going to come back.
What do you think, by the way? Because another topic I know that's been brought up a lot, especially in the last few months, basically, when from last off-season, I'd even say before that, it's basically whenever Leader first didn't get signed by teams and he had to go to Mouse Sports, ever since then, we've had this set of discussions. Because the problem is, in the past, right, when I used to give examples of players who in theory were LEC quality, they were players like Freeze, where it's like new fans won't know, so they don't even get the reference. Like, they don't know, like, is he actually like the 9th best AD carry? It's like, well, at the time he was, but like, you're not going to know because we're talking about our prime from like 6 years ago now. But obviously people like Leader, Febervan, let me think, it was the other one, Crown Shot before he came to Vitality. These are examples of players where, on paper and again in the server, they absolutely deserve to be in the LEC. Like, they're all good enough. Like, it's not like any of these players would be the worst player in their role if they came to LEC today and any of the teams, right? But the argument I've heard, and it was basically typified in an interview I did with Aaron Ayer, who obviously works as a team on their, like, I think it's the Mad Lions, like ERL team or something. When they work with these, when the coaches talk about these players, they claim the reason they don't always go for the player that's more skilled or even more proven, but they like the rookies, is this angle that they think rookies are like more moldable, because the idea is they don't have as big an ego, they haven't had as much success, so they won't sort of think, I know the way to do it and you don't. And they basically say that like they think he's more coachable, they're more receptive to being coached. Now, listen, even though I can certainly appreciate both sides of that, like in my opinion, those players should be in the league on the right teams. But at the same time, I also do appreciate that you could put together like a skilled lineup of players, but if they absolutely, like say they're really bad, then might not be receptive at all to coach, in which case you might not get anything out of them. My problem with that topic is it kind of, the reason I connect it to the earlier one is, I feel like they're also painting that a bit too black and white. Like, surely there are plenty of players who are mega coachable because they're newbies and they've never done it in the game, but no amount of coaching is going to make that player like prime Featherman or fucking Soaz, or like some of these players are just better whether they're coachable or not. Like, what do you think on this, Wickd? You've obviously been in many different levels of team. Like, what do you think about this approach? Because obviously coaches now want more power. They want to have more influence over the team.
So one thing that stands out to me is our teams that I've been on, right, have often been called uncoachable as well. For example, Froggen have been called uncoachable, very strong-willed, and blah, blah, blah. And I feel like Froggen would listen to any coach we ever had. There's never been any problems and so on. And I feel like those discussions often come because a lot of coaches are incompetent in the scene right now. I don't think it's necessarily that all these players are uncoachable. From my experience, most league players are coachable. Most league players, from what I've seen and talked to, are not completely ignorant and just egoing and will never agree with anything. So it's mostly just because the coaches are underqualified and are not good enough. And that's why some players will not listen to them, because what they say doesn't make any sense.
Fair enough. What do you think, Rich?
I mean, I agree completely. And to add to that, what I would say is that also coaches are always looking for a scapegoat. Even preemptively, right? Not, oh, the season's going bad. How am I going to, angle this so I look better? Even when they're signing teams, you can tell when they're going for scapegoats, right? Leaders like a great example where, it's much easier if I'm a head coach to go with a rookie because sure, I can justify in the promo and everything, this rookie's really talented, he is just as big a ceiling as leader, blah, 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 even if it's not true, because no one can really tell me that I'm wrong, because this guy's still a rookie, right? Sure. And if it goes badly, I can always say that he's a rookie, so he shit the bed. And I always have that perpetual safety net that it can always be a rookie's fault. Whereas if I'm the guy who can't get the most out of an already established player, that's going to reflect badly on me no matter what, right? Even if, it's not the case. Because again, we have to remember with coaching, it's very outward facing in. Most fans, most analysts even don't have too much context. So most coaches are very paranoid about how they're going to look if certain things go badly, right? And I think that's one of the main reasons why people didn't go with leader, and they can always say like, oh, this guy's difficult and he's uncoachable, blah, blah, blah. But if you're on a VOD review of leader, he's not going to be sat there like saying, shut the fuck up. No, sure, some players are more difficult than others, but it's very seldom that you get someone who is like so unmanageable that, you can't, it's not worth having the ludicrously high skill ceiling and potential that a good coach should be able to get out of that player, at least to a certain extent. That surely has to be the better long-term play, especially when it comes to someone as gifted as that. So usually, I would often judge teams based on how brave they are with these kind of decisions. And I'll also sometimes, maybe fairly, maybe not, make certain sort of soft judgments about what that might say about a coach. Because I think how you pick a team, not just on ability, but, perceived toxicity and all this stuff. To me, if I really trust that my coach is a very good coach, if someone comes to me and said, yeah, he's a great player, great talent, but he's mildly toxic, if that's the thing that sets you off and you're like, no, he's off my list, I immediately think less of my coach's potential ability to coach, because that should not be a deal breaker. Most great players have some diva about them to a certain extent, right? Others, some more than others, but I'm pretty sure that, Michael Jordan wouldn't be Michael Jordan if he didn't have some, spiteful streak to him, right? Sure. So yeah, I think it says more about the coach than the player's lack of higher ability, let's say.
Yes. Like, to me, I think you should only really use that for the extreme examples where, like, it's people who are absolutely, like antisocial, essentially. They're super disruptive. Like, they actually are literally maybe, like you say, the rare example where someone maybe is short-circuiting, like, trying to have a review or a discussion. Yeah, that's obviously, like, above and beyond what we're talking about here. The problem I have is, again, it's if they're just making, like, he's a veteran equals stuck in his way, whereas this guy, it's like, my question would be this. This would be a real question. I'm not even joking. I would say this. Why would a really brilliant, skilled, veteran, tenured player not believe in coaches, mate? That's where we should start the discussion. Because what you might find is, if you're talking about the classic ones that people say are uncoachable, so back in the day, Froggen, people like Soaz, where they just don't seem like they care about coaching, etc. I would say this. They probably have good reasons to. They probably worked a long time ago with coaches that were semi-useless or didn't have any authority, or maybe even came with ideas where it was almost like, could we maybe try this? It's like, if you're not confident in the idea, why the fuck am I listening? Why would you try and stuff? So, like, certainly the incompetent coaches that came first didn't help the equation. Like, they made people like Soaz think, that guy's here to coach the rookie, not me. I know more than him and he doesn't know anything about what I know. So in that scenario, it's not even unjustified. Some of them actually have, like, good reason to think of that. And I agree with you, definitely. It's literally a tool in your toolkit as a coach that you have to be able to get the buy-in from these guys. Like, I'll give you a quick side example where I once tried to make a similar case and a lot of people didn't get what I was talking about. Right, in CSGO, a project I just worked on last year was a project called Flashpoint, where the idea was it's like LCS. It's like a franchised league where you buy a spot in it, and then only the teams that have bought the spots play in this league, but it's in CSGO instead of League of Legends, etc. And basically, this project was actually already tried. Now we're talking like 5 years ago. It was tried in, I think, 2016 off the top of my head. I think it was at the end of 2016 they were trying to do it going into 2017. But it was called PEA. It was like the Professional Esports Association. And it literally was going to be like an LCS. It was like a North American franchise league where teams like Cloud9, Team Liquid, whoever was around there, I don't know, Envious or something, all the NA orgs basically would have had a team. But famously, what happened was it didn't happen that first time around 5 years ago because the players themselves of those teams that would have been in this league basically sort of used public attention to protest against it and said, well, we don't want to play in this league because we'd have to give up our spot in what was at the time the rival league, which is ESL Pro League, right? Now, I said to the owners, listen, I agree with you that your league is better than ESL Pro League. And, you know, for example, I know in that particular case, ESL basically has to make all the profit long before you guys can ever make any money because they're in bad financial position, you know. So I said, even though I agree with you as the owner, this would be a better league for your player. Like, you do realise, as soon as you yourself can't get your own employee into a room, give him the fucking elevator pitch and have him buy into what you're saying, why should anyone else? Like I even said in that scenario, you guys bill yourselves as like the kings of the world of marketing. You couldn't even get your own player on board with it. You couldn't get through to him as to why it was a good idea. So I would say similarly about coaching. If you have a player where even when you yourself, presumably someone who thinks they're a competent coach, if you can have these sessions with them, teach them things, show them who you are, talk to them, if after all that they're not at all receptive to it and they're not buying in, some of that has to fall on you eventually. Like there are certainly bad actors and people who just fucked up. Like I will say, one of the things I often said on talk shows was, when it comes to people like the extreme examples like Forgiven and Dardoch, the ones where there are like horror stories behind the scenes, I do agree those ones shouldn't be considered just players, because if you ever look into those scenarios, they need what I said earlier, even more so, because they essentially need real life therapy. It's nothing to do with fucking video games. Like, their problems come from a long time ago, nothing to do with League of Legends, the game. So those ones, yeah, at that point you almost have to be a psychologist. For the other ones, they are just young guys playing games. Like, you have to be someone who they want to listen to. You have to be able to get buy into an idea they haven't tried. Like, if they haven't, maybe they've got a point. You can't sell them on it.
But you know,
what do you think? Yeah,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, like,
jump in.
The best coaches in league have, since the start that I've observed, at least, obviously loads of coaches, I haven't seen how they work, but the best coaches I've seen have just been the best mediators / orators. Like, even someone like Grabs isn't, you know, shoving game knowledge down his players' throats, right? Like, these guys know how to play the game. They know how to play their individual positions. He's someone who's mediating conversations in an effective manner, being that sort of, and seen as that sort of figure with at least a modicum of authority, right? It's also the reason why Yamato Cannon, I guess not so much on Fnatic, yes, but on all his previous teams, this guy always had instant success. Did he sustain it, and did he take them to like unfathomable levels? No, not necessarily. But the reason he always had instant success is because he had an air of authority which everyone immediately gravitated to and respected. And we shared in 2015, and keep in mind, in 2015 Yamato Cannon was literally like 18 years old or something.
Sure.
And we shared a gaming office with the Roccat team at the time that he was coaching, and it was striking how much these guys just did everything at the click of his fingers, basically. Again, is this guy like one of the better, like super in-depth game knowledge guys? I wouldn't personally say so, but the coaches that have been successful or have had success didn't necessarily need that. It's much more about being sort of a coach in the traditional authority figure who's able to control and mediate conversation rather than telling them things about the game that they didn't know. The only exception I've seen to this, and you could argue that ultimately he underachieved potentially, is Prolly, right? And Prolly is the only exception that I've seen where this guy's game knowledge was so insanely good. In fact, he's the only coach I've ever seen who on like a day-to-day basis, he was telling players things they didn't actually already know. And it wasn't like, oh, you know, you've given your suggestion, I've given my suggestion, let's talk about which is better. He would say, how about this? Have you considered doing this in a lane swap? And this was like blowing their minds. Like they weren't even aware of these concepts even existed. So he gained respect for a period of time just by being seen as this like guru of the game. And he didn't necessarily have to be this sort of, all powerful leader in that sense. But other than that, whenever a coach hasn't had like strong abilities to control people socially, it's irrelevant how much game knowledge they've had. It's just collapse in on itself. So yeah, I think that's like something where, you know, because of the industry that we're in as well, and because of a lot of the background of the players and a lot of coaches are ex-players and stuff like that, these aren't necessarily the most socially gifted pool of humans in general, right? If you were to aggregate it out. Yeah. So it's still going to be a while before these people who have both sets of skills really emerge and become super successful coaches.
But I also think it's a really big thing is what kind of team are you coaching, right? Some teams don't need anything in game at all, and they only need the outside of the game and a mediator, as you talked about, right? I remember back then I was a pro player. We often had 1 to 2 hour discussions about one player that was completely irrelevant, but people just wanted to be right. And a coach can be like, yo, this is useless. It doesn't matter who's right. Go next, you know, and move on and actually control the conversation to something useful and productive where the team improves and uses the time much better. And also, I feel like the problem is, when you try to apply game knowledge and there is no correct answer, sometimes there's 2 answers, right? This can happen in a lot of games. Then if the coach is fighting about it with the players, it doesn't make any sense. You know, don't get any improvement from it. So often it's much better to have a mediator if the players are good enough.
Sure. I have 2 things to say there. One, actually, I thought the point you made at the end there, Rich, was also a key reason why this might not be understood, is since the players themselves are going to be, on average, below, significantly in some cases, below average, like social awareness, like basic understanding of how to interact, communicate, etc. Because they've just spent probably the last 5 years sat playing one specific video game all day long. Like, I often say this line, because if people have never met pro players, they never get this. I always say, whenever you meet a pro player, genuinely, just take whatever his age is and take like 4 or 5 off the number, and that's probably what his like emotional age is, or his maturity level is, like how he's probably going to act around girls, for example, or how he'll act in a party scenario, like, because again, he's just spent most of those years on a video game. It's why I never bought the angle when TSM fans used to tell us, magically we no longer think Doublelift is toxic now because he has like really matured. I was like, when did he mature? In the time it took to take the CLG jersey off and put the TSM one on? Like, he was playing League of Legends all the rest of the time. What are you talking about? Like, he didn't even have time to have the other life experiences, bro. He was just playing League of Legends in LCS for about 8 years. Like, what life experiences did he have while he was loading up the next Q game? You know, like, it's just an unrealistic expectation. So along those lines, though, as a result, if anything, that actually empowers the people who have the social skills even more. It makes them more valuable. Because I'll use a quick example here, actually. So Yamato Cannon, by the way, is literally one of the people I always think of when this is the case. I've actually made this impassioned play on many past episodes of my shows, even on the last episode of this one, that I see him as someone where, to me, it's funny, his biggest strength is obviously his skills as an orator. Like, when he talks, not only just his voice, which is very soothing to listen to, but something about how he talks, it captures your attention. He's actually very good at even sometimes, like, speaking slowly, so he doesn't rush through everything. He manages often to give, like, quite almost eloquent lines about how you say it. Because remember, it's also how you say something, whether people remember it. So I'll give you the contrast, right? Someone else who was formerly a mutual, at least, obviously I did a show with him, Veteran, right? I would use these two as the polar opposite contrast, but that'll show you why behind the scenes we have an issue with this, which is people like Veteran, and I'm picking him specifically because I do consider him someone to be an absolute expert about the game. Just look at, essentially just use his shows as predictions for the next few years, and the amount of times that those players go on to be overrated and he was right, or mega underrated and become legit. Like, it barely misses out of a lot of the people who do those shows. But his issue is, and this is what I could relate to as a person, because I used to be like this a lot when I was much younger, was he seems to have made his whole identity around the fact he's the expert about the game. And so to him, that as an obvious way to make himself feel good and then think other people aren't as good is just to only use that as a metric. It's essentially, if you think of a top trump scenario, he only selects the field of game knowledge as what he judges you by. So basically, I don't know specifically if he ever disliked Yamato, but I did get the vibe that people like him in the community, the super knowledgeable like game experts, so that's their main strength, they would look at Yamato, and because they're only using the metric of like am I the most cutting edge expert? They would always go, well, he isn't. And then often they would even like dismiss like his social skills and be like, well, he's obviously as a result, con man, and this is all just for show. And he's almost like the Monty, like Reggie Dismure's going, he's a fake coach for the cameras, and he just gives the great speech and that. It's like that. It can't just be that though, dude. Like I think both sides miss if they think that. Like obviously, by the way, someone like Yamato Kara, if they're smart, has like a fucking veteran type strategic analyst on their team. That would be an obvious way to make up your own deficit. But then all these people, because there are so many of them in the scene who are actually legit the experts at the game, you guys also have to go away and work on those social skills, because that is all that's holding you back. As soon as you level those up, the world is your oyster. Because I think a lot of those guys don't realise that even if I would agree with them that they're right about something in the game, if I send them in a room and I send Yamato Cannon, I'm sorry, I would pick Yamato to get a lot of the points through to the player better than this guy would, no matter how knowledgeable he is. What do you think on that, Rich? Because obviously you know some of the people involved that I'm talking about here. I'm using those as extreme examples, obviously, and painting with fairly broad brush here.
Yeah, I mean, Veteran is someone, obviously, that I'm close with, and I've had, like, countless conversations with him about, League and everything else under the sun. And, yeah, when it comes to, game-related stuff or whatever, he's one of the first people I'll ask. I think his actual theory on how he believes people should be coached is actually often very correct as well. But I think where someone like him maybe has a gap is moving from the theory to the reality. And I've had so many conversations, by the way, not just about League of Legends stuff or whatever, where I've ended up saying like, whoa, like at a certain point we need to stop, talking about what's pixel perfect and what's actually realistic. And right. I would usually end up agreeing with him and say, I completely agree with your philosophy and what you think should happen and why it should happen. And I don't think you've missed a step. Like I agree completely. But in reality, I think steps 3, 4, and 5 don't actually work at all. And you need to start like maybe treating someone as more of an individual or whatever. And you can't always take those pixel perfect steps, right? So, and I think that's something that he's developed over time as well. And I think he's better at that now than he was. But for sure, like if you were to combine skill sets of, let's say, Yamato Cannon and Veteran, in terms of like, all of Veteran's knowledge, and then give Yamato's presentation skills, let's say, maybe, yes. Then yeah, that would be in theory like the perfect coach, right? But yeah, I think it's just coaching is still one of those areas which is incredibly weak to me. And I think that, it's interesting that you brought up this always assume a player is like a few years younger than they are mentally or whatever. I always say that as well, where it's like this guy's basically spent an inordinate amount of time playing video games. He's essentially been in his basement for the last 5 years, and those aren't 5 years that he spent doing other normal social activities that, a lot of people of his age would. And I think one of the big issues as well is how the community perceives it and how the community kind of backs up. I can't think of a better way of saying it than terrible takes that get just thrown around and perpetuated online, right? Like whenever I see Doublelift talk about anything, he could be right, he could be wrong, but the way he talks about it is so immature and childish, right? Or childlike. I'm not, even throwing shade on Doublelift. I'm just saying he is a very immature person compared to someone of his age, in the mainstream world, right? And you can tell if you go on it's kind of like the internet gaming sort of married culture. If you go on live stream fails, people are like upvoting political takes, like which a 7-year-old may have said, right? Just unbelievably stupid, superficial, like just garbage. And they're like, wow, this is acting like something really poignant was said. And I think the same thing
as in like something like the equivalent of just saying like, guys, can't we just stop racism or something? Like some like not, you haven't even begun to start on the topic. You think you've solved it. You haven't even fucking entered the arena,
But the thing is, the simpler it is, the easier it is to upvote, right? Because you want everyone to understand it. So it needs to be extremely simple for the community to understand it. If you go in depth on something, it's going to get way less upvotes because it's too in depth for people to understand with one click. They actually have to pay attention.
Sure. Yeah. I guess my main point, because I completely agree, but I think my main point is that this unfortunately extends to like people's professions and the assumption about like what coaches actually do and how effective people are in their actual jobs, which is obviously nonsense. And if I see, if I see an interview of a football manager, right? If I see an interview of Sir Alex Ferguson after a game, I'm not going to learn anything about Alex Ferguson if I'm a realist by watching that interview. Yet the community will watch an interview of, a League of Legends coach after a game, and they'll treat it as, Plato or something, so like finest works, and be like, oh, okay, I guess this is how this guy operates, and what he said really spoke to me because of X, Y, and Z. So he must be really strong in this area. It's like, no, he's just fed you a bunch of PR waffle, most likely. And again, that's not a slant on the coach. Usually these things are kind of just going through the motions or whatever. But unless this guy has a big sit down, and that's the difference, right, between what's clickable and what's simple and what can you upvote easily, or someone actually sitting down and talking through their philosophy, you're probably not going to learn much about any coaches based on the content you see from LEC or LCS broadcast or any of these like 2-minute interviews they do after games, right? So I think people's perception of what makes a good coach and who are the good coaches, it may as well have just been a roll of the dice in terms of how these people come up with their opinions.
Wickd, what do you actually think on that topic? Because obviously you were yourself a player. What do you think of that thing where, like, am I being too harsh there when I'm saying like players are like that much more immature than whatever the average kid their age would be? What do you think?
So I don't really know, right? Because I feel like you applied it to partying and so on, or meeting girls and whatever. And I feel like all the players in Europe, at least, have been partying every single week than I was a player almost. And they have been totally normal people, most of them. I think one thing you have to apply, though, is everything you apply to the players mostly also apply to the coach, right? Because the coaches are doing the same thing.
Could be.
So a lot of coaches are also sitting inside all the time, playing the game, analyzing games, and so on. And I don't really know if it's an issue. Like, yes, players might be more immature than normal or than people in the business sector and so on. But does that actually change the performance of the gameplay, or does it matter? That's mostly what I'm thinking about.
Okay. I meant it more the perspective of, like, as Richard said, if you're an outsider and you're listening to them, essentially, just because Doublelift's like, I don't know how old he is, he's like 27 or something. He must be like over 25, I'm assuming. Obviously, to me, it's like, if you just assumed he's more like a 21-year-old kid, you'd probably get a better sense of like what his comments are like. He's not really going to be more like someone approaching 30 who's like, has a wife and kids, or like, he's not going to have that level of sort of life experience, as it were.
But I think it's also the streamer mindset, right? Because a lot of those people are streamers that are actually in front of the camera. And the streamer mindset is you want to dump down things so it's easy to digest for the people, right? You see that in all industries of all streamers, a lot, or even YouTubers, right? Everything is dumped down to an easier level because it's just better to market. It's the same in fitness industry for YouTubers. Everything is just dumbed down, super simple, and everybody understands it, and people upvote and watch it.
I would add one thing to what you just said just before that, Wicked, because this is something I actually don't really agree with, which is like, so I came like straight out of university into what is now LEC, right? And he's right in what he says about, like, I think the European scene generally was pretty social. Like, obviously it's different because in LA, even though it's quote unquote in LA, 90% of the teams for most of the time they weren't actually based in LA. So their opportunity to like even leave the house and go and do interesting things was way more limited than it was in EU, where basically everyone was based either in Cologne or in Berlin. And he's right in what he says, in that it was like kind of a social vibe. Like, a lot of people did go out, they did socialize. But me having sort of, I guess, being lucky from an observer standpoint, in that sense, having the juxtaposition of like being through a few years in university and then coming to esports, to me, it wasn't the same, like, at all. And to me, it was like seeing people who were the same age as the people I was in university with, but they were acting like high school children. That was like my perception. I think a lot of it, and why maybe it got covered up, slightly, or was less clear, is because you have to remember, like, a
fucking stupid ass comment about how like TSM was spending too much of the profits from League of Legends on like CS:GO or something, which, if people don't know, was like objectively, factually the opposite scenario. But that's just the level Mark Merrill and Riot head people are on. So in the same way as they got that to be a big issue, they've managed to connect the fact that they can't just have carte blanche to import any player from around the world, which they claim, apparently some of them, that they need to have to compete with, the Koreans, the Chinese, etc., even Europe potentially. They've connected that factor with the notion that, like, this is why they underperform internationally, which is already like, there's a tenuous connection there, but it's not as like cause and effect as they're making it. So as a result, understandably, basically every time NA doesn't do really well internationally, which is going to happen, so this is an obvious case where Cloud9 didn't even make the playoffs of MSI, it's going to make people immediately come back to the same discussion of, does this mean we need more imports? Or in this particular case, I think you even saw how it affected the framing of this MSI, because it gave people all this hype around teams like Fentonet from Oceanic region that they never would have cared about before, because some of them were thinking, maybe these players will be in the LCS next season. Maybe, half the jokes were even like, wow, perks cost 11 million, but you could have bought this whole team for X, all the obvious fucking most basic 20 IQ half-baked takes on the tournament. So the issue here, Rich, basically is it was told by Riot, and you can get into the specifics. Like, essentially, they've said, like, we're not going to, like, open up the import rule. In fact, they haven't thus far done anything beyond the Oceanic thing. Like, a lot of people suspect next year, they'll just make all the minor regions be accessible in the same way, and as a result, you can sort of feast on them if you're an NA owner. What do you think about this topic? Like, where do you even come in on this one? Like, as someone who works as an agent, like, do you actually, in theory, this is an angle a lot of people won't understand. In theory, if you're a player, unless you're a player like a Vulcan, Doublelift, Dardoch, who directly benefit from this sort of a ruling, actually for most players, import rule actually is essentially a negative, right? 'Cause it prevents them from going to certain regions or getting value within the contract. So where do you even come into this topic from as we go into the specifics, Rich? Are you against the concept of an import rule?
I mean, just quickly on the players' side, I mean, obviously it has the flip side of if the gates are open and everyone can import, then the average salary per person who's imported is obviously going to be less, right? Right now they're treated as a rarer commodity,
yes.
So they're going to be, in terms of like the actual import rule, just to sort of frame what Kris Greeley, the LCS commissioner, said, because I think it's important to say, he basically said. He just kept reiterating how it's a global rule. And to me, the implication when I was first listening to him was, okay, he's basically implying that the NA teams are pushing for it, but because it's a global rule, it's not just about them and it has to be consistent and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But then he kind of surprised me at the end when he tacked on, oh, and by the way, the NA teams didn't request it. And I think what actually happened and what he actually means is, to me, it's kind of a disingenuous technicality argument, which is the NA teams got told no. So the NA teams were like, oh, well, I mean, yeah, at that point, they're not going to push for it, right? They've been told no, so they're not going to they're not, going to go so far as to have a movement to try and get the rule moved. But the reason why that's how I believe it went down, there's a lot of precedence for this, which is as a European org owner, we were essentially... It felt like you were in a castle made out of wood with water constantly pushing against the walls, right? This is not some big stone construction that you're sure is going to stand the test. Like, we were constantly batting this off, and every single owners meeting, every single conversation we ever had with this about Riot, it was NA are pushing really hard for this, but, we're really hoping that we can hold them off. Like, that was kind of how the dynamic was. And actually, to me, they always felt there was some kind of air of inevitability that eventually they would just lift the rule, or maybe, let's say, add one more, like now you can have 3 imports or whatever the case may be. So I'm actually surprised it's held off for as long as it has. But make no mistake, the NA teams have been pushing for this unanimously since day one, basically. So in terms of what I think about it, I'm heavily against it. I think that the whole purpose of having regions and these international tournaments where you come together and you think, hey, who is the best? What are the, tier list of the regions, etc. That will still exist to a certain extent. Like, people were like, NA teams would just buy all the Korean Academy teams. It's like, do you think those are going to do as well outside of the Kesper system? Like, no, there will still be elements of identity, but I'm really against it because I kind of think it defeats at least the meat of the purpose of the regional system. And also it's just a band-aid, right? Like, it's covering up for much bigger issues in terms of how to actually fix North America as a region, which I think most people know what those sort of headline causes are, but a lot of them require a lot of effort, which they don't want to go to. They rather just throw money at importing more players. And a lot of them are, technically very difficult to do, like issues with the server itself and stuff, right? But in principle and in practicality, I'm heavily against lifting the import rule.
Right, Wickd, you obviously were yourself an import when you played in the TCL, the Turkish league, because technically they can only have so many imports. People might know they've had Koreans in that league. So where do you come down on this one? You've obviously benefited at one point in your career potentially from this. Maybe it made you bear more money, I don't know, as an import. Do you think there should be import rules? Do you have any sense on where they should be? Would you open it up completely like the old days? What do you think?
So I think it's very important to keep everything regional, right? Because the fandom is about being regional. You can look at the French league, how amazing it's doing because all the French people can get behind that league, right? And I feel like America's somewhat losing the identity because for me, I used to watch all LCS games, right? Nowadays, I'm like, wow, to watch LCS is the secondary league for Europe, Korea, and NA. Like, it's a split league that's just not as good. And it doesn't make any sense. But if it's purely NA and you still knew the names like Doublelift and so on, I would 100% still watch it because I think it'd be much more interesting. So I think it's very important to keep the import rules. And also, I don't even think it helps NA to remove it. Like, if you look at NA right now, they have so many imports. Some teams almost have full import squads if they don't already. And they're still performing really terrible.
Yeah, I have to say, I definitely think the point that you make there, Rich, by the way, one of the main reasons why this is a focal point is because not only is it a band-aid, but it's sort of the ultimate short-term band-aid fix, because the logic goes, if I could really get, like, obviously the pick would be someone like fucking Chovy or someone ridiculous, you know, if you really could do, like, the sort of deal that people like Steve Arner said, try every year to do, with, like, you try and just sell that guy on, like, this is going to be the ultimate deal for you, you know, you do the same thing with perks, you're going to change the culture, don't worry about all the problems in LCS before. Obviously, in the very, very, very short term of the first year, you might get what was equivalent to back in the day when Bjergsen came over and they just tear the whole league up and they look way better and you get to feel like you got a better chance at it. The problem with that, in my opinion, is though, like, again, how many of these players, some of them, the rare ones have done it, like Core JJ, but how many of them really are going to maintain that level outside of Korea effectively? Whether it's because, you know, they just lose hope in the system, they have a teammate that doesn't practice, they're not with Koreans, they're not being driven by the same, like, because I always think this is an angle people don't get. Here's a great analogy for it. Everyone who's ever worked out knows that the reason why the concept of a gym body is really good is because when you go with a gym body, you're going to push each other, aren't you? Like, if you went there and you were on your own and it was a Sunday morning and you'd been out on the piss on a Saturday night, if you're on your own, you might just quit 3 push-ups in and go, fuck this, actually, I think I'll just do it tomorrow. If you're there with your gym buddy, odds are you're going to look over at him and you're not just going to collapse after 3 push-ups, are you going to go, fuck, I've got to at least, you know, I've got to at least seem like I can vaguely do them. You'll make yourself do more. So similarly, I don't think people get it. I've always said this. It's not in the Koreans' DNA to be good at the games. It's just that there's some fucked up side byproduct of their culture that makes them just go hard as fuck in the same way as they do, by the way, at school. So in the sense, this is why, another reason, by the way, where we'll never have this in the West. Don't worry. Like, if you hear all the horror stories, you'll never have to be in that scenario. Because think about it. We live in a world where people are still just like, can't we just normalize being completely unhealthy? Like, you're never going to have a world where it's like, you are aware, essentially, the same peer pressure that makes people, in a negative sense, kill themselves when they, like, can't get A's in school in Korea, is the same pressure when channeled in a vaguely positive sense that's making them the best players in the world in a video game. It's the same impetus, a social pressure that comes from everyone in your social circle, friends, family, right? That's never going to exist in the West. And the problem is, those are the areas, if you don't just bring in those players temporarily, that you'd have to start addressing. Like, I agree with you, Rich. The problem becomes, if, like, on a lot of these talk shows, we often come to the conclusion, for example, like, the reason why European imports to America don't make them better is because you can't get past things like player entitlement and not wanting to have people tell you bluntly what you did wrong, or for example, people not listening to coaches in the sense of, like, I don't want to play that champion or test my limits. So basically, you need a culture change, and that's really fucking hard. Like, one team alone, it's going to be hard to do that even within one team. Even in terms of the players, it's going to be hard to get the right players that can do that. So I do think they do that because it's just the most easy, obvious solution, but I don't even necessarily agree it is the solution. Like I said earlier, I think even if you got Chovy and you got, I don't know, fucking pick anyone you want, some sick Korean AD carry and then some Chinese jungler, like, at the end of the day, you're probably still not going to be better than the best LPL team, are you? Like, it's not really going to solve the problem. I don't know. I feel like that one's a bit of, like, I almost feel like that's like a scarecrow they've put up to just, like, get what they want financially, which is they just want to market the best players in LCS. You know, like, legitimately, they do want Chovy to be in a Team Liquid jersey and then Deft to be in a fucking Cloud9 jersey. Well, like, they just want to market that angle. I don't know that I even buy that they believe they would win Worlds.
I think one thing that's also missed a lot is, in a team, I think it's extremely important to actually trust each other and be friends. Like, just having good players and only importing people all the time doesn't necessarily create that bond between people. And I've noticed that teams are good friends. Like, if you look at G2, for example, if you look at old CLG and so on, and a lot of other teams, they play much better and everyone seems to perform better. And also, whenever something bad happens, like they lose some games in a week or whatever, they come back much stronger next week and it doesn't affect them as much if the teams are actually friendly towards each other and have a good team culture.
Well, what I would kind of morph that point a bit, because I think there's a good point in there, but how I would morph that is to say, when you're dealing with imports, that's on steroids, right? Because if you imagine you go over as a Korean and you don't speak much English or whatever, but immediately you're put into a winning scenario and things are going well, that feeling is going to carry that guy's emotions for as long as that wave lasts, right? But if you're a Korean and you go over, you feel already a bit isolated culturally and most likely from the people that you don't know very well, and then you start losing, have fun trying to, you know, pull that guy back up with you, right? That's going to be a lot more difficult than if your best friend from Denmark's like on a team with you and you had a crap week. You're probably going to be able to G each other up at some point, right? So yeah, I definitely think that's a thing, particularly when it comes to imports.
I would even say on that as well, by the way, because obviously people might take that take from Wickd and just make it essentially like the one that we've all made fun of, like the power of friendship angle. Like, it can't just be the friendship alone, obviously. You have to be good at the game. But the area I do agree with him in that sense is, essentially, if you just take out the word friendship and make it like you have a closer, like, actual, like, personal bond with the player, like, he's not just your teammate, he's someone you care about, and you care about where his mental health's at and all the rest of that jazz. You can obviously see how that would help people, be resilient when they're losing, bounce back from losses, like basically not blame each other. There's obvious angles where it would help. I would say that also ties into the immaturity angle, because if you think about it, right, one of the things I am always incredibly impressed about with actually like European football, soccer, is how many of the teams in my own country of the Premier League, right, obviously one of the main leagues in the world now, I actually genuinely didn't think that we would be able to have teams that would be the best, that would have players from every possible country. Like, I didn't think you could take like an Italian winger and put him with a Brazilian striker and then a fucking guy from Poland as the midfielder. Like, I genuinely thought like the culture class is going to be too crazy on this. Like, basically, I thought it was like CS and you would probably need like, a general core from the same place, and then you can have one or two geniuses basically. And one of the reasons I think I was wrong is what I underestimated actually is when I use the esports example, those are young guys who haven't necessarily had the level of maturity. In theory, a football player is probably like a 28-year-old man who has lived in many different cultures, probably already been through a lot of life tests, just moving like from Brazil to fucking Italy or something. So, and I'll even throw in, even those teams tend to only succeed when they have the most charismatic fucking coaches in the entire league. That's when you have to have like Jose Mourinho, Pep Guardiola, like these guys aren't just there again for the X's and O's. They're there for some Yamato cannon factor where it's how do they get the buy-in? How do they get people to work together? So, and I'd even say, by the way, I would imagine how they succeed if you listen to them on like documentaries and stuff where you have the behind the scenes footage. They're just making like a scaffolded version of what we're talking about. They make like a team vibe or like, I know, for example, I've seen a lot of stuff where Jose Mourinho's angle is like, he makes it like us versus them. And like, all the media wants us to lose us and they think we're boring and the rivals all think we're over it. Like they do, essentially, they create the same vibe that you'd have if you were all on the same team or from the same background, etc. So there is something to that.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to say, and age for age as well, though, it's like a good point of contrast, because if you get an 18-year-old who's having his first split in LEC or whatever, and then you make him do a post-game interview, compare that to an 18-year-old who's had his first start for like a big team in football. The 18-year-old in football will come across as way more articulate, way more rounded, way more sort of man of the world-ish than the League of Legends player would. Rugby would be an like even better example, right? Because obviously rugby is like more middle class, so you're dealing with like different cultural backgrounds there. But the point is, whether it be tennis or whatever, because of the nature of the sport, and that because it's, without thinking of a way to put it better, it's an outside, much more sociable activity. These people tend to come in way more rounded than your average 18-year-old, League of Legends star would.
I mean, I can agree to that. I mean, that's pretty obvious, I think.
I think that's why I think that's one of the reasons why they can instantaneously get along a lot better as well. You also have to consider like the differences between most traditional team sports. Again, I say most because obviously, something like NBA is, the only 5 players on the court. But again, the biggest squad is like 13 players, right? And obviously in football, the squad's 23 players. In rugby, 30 players or whatever. If there are like 2 or 3 people that you really don't get along with, you're going to have your little clique or your sort of safer.
You can sort of get away from the others.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Where it's like you still have everyone going into work has some social safety net, whereas there's only 4 other players on a League of Legends team. So if you don't get along with any of them that well, tough shit. And to be honest, if you get along with only one of them particularly well, that's probably going to be tough shit as well. So yeah.
That was actually the reason why way back in the day, I was one of the first people to identify that Western teams, particularly Americans, would have massive problems with the team house structure because there's just only 5 people on a team. So as a result, my joke used to be whenever I would see a team sign like 2 or 3 players, like so the obvious example now would be like if they had still had the old setup, like when Vitality had self-made a leader, everyone's already joking that it's going to like blow up or whatever. My joke used to be that's like a fucking steel cage death match because they're just trapped in a room with each other for like 3 months. Like the idea is if you don't like that guy, it doesn't even matter if in the first month nothing happens. Eventually something's going to happen. Someone's going to eat someone's food. Someone's going to complain about someone's going to lose a game. Like, unfortunately, yeah, I agree. If you have a team that's full of people, you can just let that guy do his job and he can just fuck off over the other end and you can just hang with the 4 people you're cool with. Yeah, that's definitely a factor people don't factor in. Like, if you're in a League of Legends team, 5 players, just inevitably you're going to have to interact with those players fairly frequently. Like the chat, and you'd have to be pretty mature to like overlook obviously the social friction that you're going to have if you don't like each other. Yeah, an angle I thought we could pivot this to, by the way, was I saw Travis did an interview with Mithy right after MSI, and one of the things that Mithy was talking about. This is how sad it is in League of Legends, guys, that like we have to bring these topics up and we always have to discuss them as though they're like abstract ideas. Like, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had X? But then when you actually talk about what you're talking about, if you're from any other game in esports, you're like, this still hasn't been fixed now. So the issue Mithy brought up was he thinks that there should be, understandably, a replay system in League of Legends, and even if it was like the Proview angle, if you record the Proview thing or whatever, which by the way technically I have stock in, which I always just say as a disclaimer because that's how actually ethics work, but okay, right? When you have these programs, essentially the idea is, I understand why, if people don't know, coaches in League of Legends sometimes had to, for many years, literally manually go frame by frame through VODs and just like use pencil and paper and write down things like, right, you place this ward here, and then afterwards, like in the laning phase, I can only see little portraits, but it looks like he got like the auto off and then he won the trade. Like they're having to do all the shit that anyone in any other game, like in Counter-Strike, by the way, you would just go to the main website, hltv.org, you download the demo and you go to whatever POV you want. You just look for the whole game at everything that guy was doing. So Mithy's argument was he wants there to be like a database, and not just for teams and players, for everyone. Like why can't everyone go and download, like for example, a replay from MSI and see, right, here was the whole laning phase of Xiaohu in the top lane, or fucking Wei the jungler, what did he do against Canyon, right? To me, it's an obvious point, right? So essentially, I understand that I'm assuming everyone's going to be in favour of it, but do you have any thoughts, like Wickd, from your perspective? Like, I know League's been your main game. Is it not weird that there's just never been proper replays? Like any other game I know of has this feature, pretty much.
So from my perspective, if I was in one of the best teams in the world, right? Then I'd be like, yeah, we don't want this. This is really terrible. This is a bad idea, right? Games, you shouldn't do it. Because it's in my best interest not to share replays because it helps teams that are worse than me, right? I think as a content creator now, I'm on the complete opposite side where I'm like, I want it open because then I can make content about it and it's good. And it's something that it hurts the best teams, but it helps everyone else in the scene. And maybe it hurts Riot Games because of monetary value as well. I'm not entirely sure on that. But I think overall for the scene, it's a very healthy thing to have it open.
What do you think, Rich?
I mean, yeah, I think obviously kind of knowledge by, unanimous diffusion where everyone has access to everything basically is only going to prop the overall aggregate level of the game up, right? And as Wickd says, like, obviously that would be a situation where it's much more difficult to stay on top than reach the top because of how that would kind of impact the top teams. But in my opinion, like... Again, yeah, it so far as it would be maybe somewhat in my power or whatever as a player on the top team to not want it. Ultimately, I think if you're like, you shouldn't be against the idea. I would never be actively lobbying against the idea because I think, you want to, it's like the old adage of like, fighters want to fight fighters when they're at their best so there could be no excuses. It's like you kind of want everyone to push the scene higher, not just because it makes your own accolades more impressive or whatever, but it's probably going to push your team's level as well. Once people catch up to you in certain areas, then you're going to have to innovate, right? I think this replay system would really encourage innovation. And obviously, initially, it would just be copying, right? Like you get the lower tier teams in the lesser leagues just straight up copying strategies from being able to see every, LPL player's point of view or whatever. But I think it would plateau relatively quickly. And then from that point onwards, people are actually using the information to innovate and to push push the envelope. So, yeah, I mean, I see no negative reasons whatsoever to not have it other than what Wickd already outlined, which is obviously in the short term it could impact your status as the absolute best team if you're fearful that everyone's just going to steal your strats, and I'm sure that absolutely would happen. But I think overall for the scene it would be good, and I think it would be, if this happened and I was to attend the first World Championships, if they released it in spring, let's say, it would also be like a string to my bow, right? That I won Worlds despite everyone literally being able to see like every tiny thing that we did theoretically, right? We were the first team to do it, or we did it in the era of replays. That would like add some sort of clout to my own achievements. So yeah, I think it would be good.
Because if people don't know, one reason I actually found a new angle on this that a lot of people won't know because they're only from League of Legends and they don't know the other games is, right, the angle everyone always gets. I said earlier on about how fans will always like come up with their own reason as to why you did or didn't do something. There's a way to like mentally resolve the tension of there being an issue, like, oh, should we have import rules or not? Like, they'll come up with their own theory. If there's not one presented, they will just fill this vacuum with their own theory as to why it does or doesn't. So the classic one they always say in League is that old meme from Reddit that goes like, oh, League of Legends is like really badly coded and it's all spaghetti code and everything's a minion and they couldn't code it to do the replays because it was, making too large file size. Here's the problem with that angle, right? First of all, yes, League of Legends is a game that's very old and it wasn't intended for to be played in 2021, blah, blah, blah. But the reason why that doesn't actually hold weight anymore is a detail a lot of people I notice in esports. It's convenient how people never bring up the shit in their own scene. They just complain about other scenes. So we just had the first LAN in Valorant, right? League of Legends, Riot Games rather, or the game, the FPS game they've made to be their version of Counter-Strike. A lot of people are still not aware of this fact, Rich. I don't know if you will be, if you followed the game or not. Valorant doesn't have replays either. It doesn't have a demo system to this day.
Yeah.
Now, that logically cannot have anything to do with League of Legends being coded in 2008 or something, because it's a totally different game and it was only made in the last 2 years or something. So to me, that actually implies something I always suspected all along, which is, for whatever reason, I feel like Riot are just antithetical to the idea of a replay system. I'm not sure what it would be entirely, but something about it seems to turn them off, mate. So there's something about it that means they don't want it, because especially the fact, remember, that the billing of how people frame Valorant is that it's the Counter-Strike competitor, and that people frame it as Riot's coming to sort of take Valve's property, and in the same way as League of Legends overtook Dota, etc. So the implication would be, if you wanted to win people over, you would make all the features that Counter-Strike has. But it actually seems on this one like they're just going to sort of ignore people asking for it.
Maybe they're just scared that if their game gets reviewed enough times, everyone will just realise it's a slightly less skillful version of Counter-Strike. That would be my only theory on that one. I don't know. It's bizarre.
I mean, they could also be trying to monetize it, right? Look at Proviews. Proviews cost money. I remember paying for it myself, right?
Yes, true.
And that's a good angle for Riot Games. They want to monetize angles for people to get better at the game or analyze the game to a deeper level. And also, I think this restricted how much content you're allowed to make on LSC and Proviews. So I think it's probably a monetary angle, which I mentioned earlier as well, a bit.
By the way, again, I will just reiterate, I technically have some sort of obscure indirect financial stake in the company that made Proview. Not directly, I don't make money from Proview myself, I just have ownership in the company. So I'll say that because I am about to then say the sentence, I'm not against the premise of Proview, but I mean in that regard. I don't mind if Riot wants to monetize it, by the way. That's why I would marry the two concepts of what Mithy says about a database with something like this, and I would just make it like you have a pass you pay for monthly, and then you could either do it, depends which way you want to go on this. If Riot wants to somehow help teams, they could give them a free pass, obviously, or they could just have a different tiered pass. If anything, maybe you charge the teams for it. It's a service, right? I know in Counter-Strike, for example, the whole reason people made those advanced stats databases was the naive dream that the teams would pay them for access each month, $1,000 to have access to all this extra stats info, because they were taking the angle of it's going to be like Moneyball in fucking the movie or whatever, which obviously never really happened. But I get it, you could have that as a service. But I also agree with Mithy. I hope it will be open for the public. Even if it's through something like Proview, all you have to make it something like $10 a month, and the kind of person who's a hardcore fan, that's not too big a threshold. I'm in for $10. The point is, what do I get for it? If I get access to all the Proviews, I don't think there's a problem with that. If Riot need to make more money, they can do that. I just want the functionality, personally, because I've always said, I'll give you a quick example. When I first came into League of Legends was around early 2013. I followed the game a little bit before that, but it was when I started actually watching it. And if everyone knows, my favourite player at the time was Flame of CGN Displays. Well, famously, he was the one who did all the Flame Horizons. Now, here's the sad thing about that, guys. Not a single human being in this world has ever seen the whole laning phase on any of those fucking games, because obviously the camera wasn't on that the whole time. So I remember even back then thinking, this is absurd. So I can't even know what he did at this moment in the game. And that's just the world we all live in. So I find that bizarre. I wonder actually if there is a bigger issue though, because I know, for example, Rich, actually, this is supposedly was also a problem in Overwatch, believe it or not. In Overwatch, what I said before was legit what Overwatch teams had to do. Overwatch League teams would have people watching demos, and theirs is an FPS, for God's sake, so they would have to pause an FPS and do things like guess based on what they could see on the screen, or the radar thing, where someone could be and what they were doing at that moment. And that game also didn't have a replay system. So I don't know what this is. It does seem like this is something that the game devs themselves, maybe Wickid's right, maybe they just haven't found how they want to monetize it, what angle with it, but it seems like what they don't want to do is give away the free functionality you used to get in games before they sort of cared about the esports side.
I think there must be some technical aspect to it, which they're just absolutely stumped by. And the reason I say that is simply because Proview did exist, right? And obviously they had like the bare bones, or they have the bare bones to do a lot of these things, like the way you interact with the normal replay system in game, for example, like, and how Proview works. You can see a lot of the functionality there, but there must just be some weird like thing that they just can't get to function with actually onboarding like an overarching service or something like that. And my guess would be that it probably will exist at some point, because again, one thing that Riot has been very good at is milking people for money, right? And I don't mean that in a negative or a positive way, but there's absolutely a market for this. It would be very lucrative, I would imagine, and there's no way that they're choosing just out and out not to do it for the sake of not doing it. I think there must be some kind of technical issue that they're struggling with, because the bare bones are there for sure, and it would just be a cash grab other than anything else. And again, not in a negative way.
But I mean, the functionality is already there, right? Teams do already get replays of their own games, and I remember even when I played, we were able to get replays of our games if you wanted them. So I know the functionality is there. I also know there's replays you can get as a content creator, like you download old clients, so you can use old replays as well. Okay. So I don't know if it's a technical problem, because that'd be weird to me, but maybe it's how to scale it up to the entire community problem.
I think you maybe hit the nail on one of the points, right? Which is, if you're doing something in like a huge, let's just pretend it's a huge database, a huge archive, you as an individual have the know-how maybe to download which version of the game to be able to watch which replay or whatever, but to incorporate that into a easy accessible system where people can be like, okay, I want to watch this, I want to watch that, and maybe the videos they want to watch are 2 seasons apart. Maybe there's some technical issue in terms of what version of the game they can view that in or whatever. Like, I don't know. As I said, my guess would be there is some technical aspect to it, because otherwise I don't know why Riot would turn down the chance to make money off this. But I also agree with you that, yeah, as I said, I think the functionality seems to be there, that there must just be some kind of roadblock for them.
Right, in terms of one more that I wanted to highlight from LCS, I'm going to go down here, massively discussed. And like, where do you come down on this, Rich? Like, are you in favour of core streaming? How do you see it within the Riot world, where obviously in this particular case, you can't just choose to do it? Like in CS, for example, if I just contact the tournament and they happen to allow me to, they're fairly loose as to what you do. Obviously, you just don't have conflicting sponsors, basically. Riot does, within all these sorts of things, have a vibe, as you might have seen by I Will Dominate himself getting that ban from core streaming for however long it was, 6 months, a few months or something. They certainly always do bake into the pie, as it were. There's a sort of like a behavioural standard you have to meet, or don't be sort of outside of the Riot purview, what we think is cool. What do you think of the whole core streaming topic, Rich?
So I think that obviously there's multiple angles to view it from. I would argue as a neutral, or as let's say a fan, that I should probably be in favor, just because I think the most important thing, or what should be the most important thing to a fan, is probably the growth and sustainability of the individual esports. And I think you're going to bring the most eyeballs most quickly by having co-streaming. I think there are a lot of games that people just simply wouldn't watch if they couldn't watch their favorite streamer co-stream it. I mean, for me personally, let's just take LCK as an example, right? Let's say LS is doing LCK co-stream. I watch LCK, yeah. So I watch LCK sometimes. I usually watch the playoffs. I usually don't watch that much of the regular season. If I were an LPL fan, hell no am I watching like the regular season of my own volition if like someone I don't know or like is not associated with it. That's not going to happen. So for me personally, I wouldn't watch a lot of the LCK games if I didn't watch LS co-streaming them. That's like just a personal anecdote. So I think for the overall like growth of the individual scenes, I mean, you saw it with Valorant, right? Valorant had however, like they went over 1 million concurrent for their tournament, but a huge chunk of that was just Shroud.
Yes.
And when I was actually watching it, I never once went on the official stream. I only watched it through Shroud's stream, which wasn't nearly as interesting as I thought it would be, by the way. So yeah, sure. I'm not advertising Shroud's stream, but yeah, I mean, the guy had like 400,000 concurrent at one point during the final. So it's like, and I understand what the counter arguments for it are, but at the same time, I don't really see like too much downside. at least immediately. And for me, as I said, especially for something like Valorant, like if I was on the development, the scene development team essentially for Riot Games when it came to Valorant, I would be like, treating this as a roaring success and like, let's keep pushing the co-stream. Like, hell yeah.
This
Obviously,
is the goal for them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, obviously for League, the game's already much more established or whatever, but I still don't really necessarily see it as a bad thing. And as I said, if you have the right people in the right places to do it, as I said, someone like LS with Korea, someone who's very knowledgeable about LPL, if that's Dom, then great, then Dom with LPL. I think that will educate the scene about the other regions much more, make the game much more accessible. So yeah, I mean, overall, I'm in favor. But to be perfectly honest, there are probably some pitfalls that I haven't really considered because I haven't put like that much thought into it.
Fair enough. Where do you come down, Wickd?
From my perspective, I'm in favor of it. One thing I'm a bit sad about is that it's NA only, pretty much. Like the LCS was only open to NA partners. And now, because of that, Dom is also getting the LPL partnership, which I think he deserves because he watched all the games, he was really into it, and that's great. But again, it feels like it's NA favoritism, which I think is bad. And it also closes off the EU market a little bit. Then one thing I want to hit, I think co-streams are amazing and I think they're good for the scene. And I think it's great, but the problem is I think some co-streams can be too toxic and it can hurt players' brand a lot. So I think they should dial down a little bit on toxicity, just a tiny bit, like, right? They have to be real, they have to be authentic, but they don't have to completely shit on a player over and over and over again. And sometimes it's even unfairly. Like, I think Finn is a player who's been playing quite good and he's had good performances from CLG. And I think he's had negative comments, right? When I watch co-streams, too much, even though it was completely unfair. And then the last point I want to talk about is if you look at Fortnite, right? Fortnite was amazing at creating superstars. And I think co-stream is the same thing. And I think it's extremely good for the game. So when you make these co-streams, LS viewership blew up, Dom's viewership blew up, Doublelift is doing good, but he was doing good before. But I think this is a good way to create superstars that actually help the entire ecosystem of the game and the streaming of the game and everything around it.
I mean, one thing I do think is like a massive positive is obviously as the viewer, it's just more choice for you, isn't it? Like, in fact, I even think it actually, in some fucked up sense that people don't think about, it actually solves a big problem that I think we have, which is in line with what we were talking about earlier about how certain streamers and YouTubers and whatever dumb things down to hit like the lowest common denominator of all the clicks, and the guy, essentially like 14-year-olds who don't know a lot about the topic might be able to engage with it. That's always been the problem I've had, which is because when I follow the game, I'm following it from a hardcore perspective of like esports only, probably I'm not in the case of League of Legends because I have to talk about LCS, but in theory the best teams and only the best games. Like, I want someone who caters to that. So whereas I might like to listen to LS or, I mean, anyone, if someone like Monty had done it back in the day for LCK, I would have listened to him, obviously, if he hadn't been on the mainstream. The problem is that audience that actually is generally going to watch as a casual base, maybe that wouldn't be appropriate for them. Like, I could see a lot of like really, really casual fans being turned off by LS if they're not into the esports side. Say they are just the TSM fan who's just a fan of the League of Legends and they like TSM sort of. Like, you're not going to want to hear someone go super in depth on the draft and say the game's lost because they picked something on R3 instead of fucking like R4. Like, you aren't going to want to hear that. Like, that's actually inappropriate for you on some level. So even though it's against my own interests in that sense, like, that's why basically I don't want there to be one stream. I want to have this like palette that I can choose from. Like, right, I like this type of a guy, or I think in case of someone like Dom, he's sort of marrying it all, doing a bit of entertainment, a bit of analysis, a little bit of for the casual fans because he has a lot of viewers himself. So I know everyone who's a big streamer knows how to also sort of communicate with the idiots in their fan base and just sort of like find a way to accommodate them. So I think it's good in that regard. One thing I do want to ask you about though, because this is one thing I do have my own qualms about, is I actually wonder how much impact it will have, though, because part of me wants to believe that a lot of people who watch Dom stream anyway will think, oh, I'll check it out, I'll try watching this game. But for me, one of the reasons why, even LCK, people on Reddit will all tell you they watch LCK. If you actually look at their takes, they clearly barely do, and they just repeat the same things and watch the big televised game, as in if it was like, you know, the equivalent of SKT versus KT a few years ago. Like, the problem I have is, in my opinion, in esports, a lot of people as a poser like to pretend they watch the best region and the best teams, but I get the feeling most people just watch the obvious ones. Like, if you're American, you probably watch LCS. If you're European, you watch LEC. Maybe you watch, as I say, the big game. Like, if Dam1 played Gen G, if they were the second best, if they play, maybe you watch that. So I actually wonder, though, how much actual crossover it will create. Like, do you actually think from this that a whole bunch of, for example, Western viewers are going to now watch LPL that wouldn't otherwise? Where do you come down on this?
I mean, I would say yes. In terms of how much, I'm not sure. But I agree with what you said about, a lot of people just claim that they watch regions or whatever when they don't actually. But I think a lot of people that, for example, let's say, watch LS or watch Dom, and they're these people who claim that they watch it but don't really. I think now they probably will, or some of them will, right? So I do actually think there will be some crossover there. I don't think it will be like absolutely astronomical at the start, or I think it will be, something that builds up slowly. But for example, let's say, LS is co-streaming LCK and he has 25,000 viewers. I mean, those 25,000 people, maybe they're not paying that much attention to the game, but they are watching LCK, right? And in my opinion, that's probably at least 20,000 people more than did before. I think probably only 1 in 4 of LS's fans before he started co-streaming probably actually were watching like every LCK game, right? So I do think it will have an impact in that sense. But yeah, so just to touch on something Wickd said, because I think it's like an interesting point and a very difficult point to make good points around, I would say. This idea of like how it negatively affects the players, right? Because I think this is super important in that there is definitely this relationship between the community and like players getting dropped and fired. Like this is actually a real thing, even if people don't think it is. Like public perception and pressure does actually impact these kind of decisions. And how can you police it? Should you police it? And with these kind of things, I would usually be, on the side of I think if you allow someone to do something, then you're allowing them to do it. And within the parameters that have already been established, this person should be able to say whatever they want, within reason, right? I usually fall down on that camp. I think it's a very difficult thing to talk about reasonably. But I think if you look at other sports, for example, something that's become very big recently is the concept of like fan channels with like European soccer, right? Like AFTV is obviously like super famous. There's a Manchester United one, United Stand. Basically every team now in the Premier League pretty much has these fan channels. And obviously what happens is, and by the way, these channels get like a hell of a lot of viewership. Like the live watch alongs on like AFTV have like over 100,000 people watching and stuff, which are essentially co-streams, right? So these are big things. And obviously there's a lot of, positive, we're all supporting the same team kind of thing, but there's also a hell of a lot of negativity that gets like doubled down on week after week after week of why is this guy still playing? He's absolute trash, and everyone piles in or whatever. And there's not the same level of relationship between like public pressure and like players losing their jobs in a game as big as football. There isn't, but it's the same kind of concept. So I think it's something that's very difficult to do, because in football, I would say it's not a problem, right? Or at least it's not a sizable enough a problem for it to actually become an issue in terms of affecting players. Obviously, football players aren't immune to, hating social media because people flame them, or hating newspapers. And same for, LEC players, right? But should we treat them differently just because we're essentially reverse engineering results-based analysis, right? We're saying because actually the result is slightly more negative, or maybe a lot more negative in some cases in league, should we apply a different philosophy? And honestly, I'm not sure. I'm genuinely not sure. Again, it's not something I've thought about like loads and loads and loads, but I do tend to side with the idea of if you allow someone to do something, like if I allow you, like if I'm a TO and I hire you, Thorin, for a Counter-Strike event to be on the desk, and I say, our only rules are no swearing and blah, blah, blah. If you then, go off script or say something that I wouldn't expect you to say, as long as it's, not going against the parameters we set out, I think you should be allowed to do it within reason, right? So I think it's a very difficult one. And I'm not sure you can really police it effectively at all. So in that sense, is it really even worth trying to sort of construct something around that? Because LS might say something about, an LEC player, an LCS player, an LCK player, which someone might perceive as being very negative. Someone else might perceive as really good constructive criticism, right? So I think it's really difficult. And I don't know what you think about that, Wickd.
Maybe Wickd can give us the vibe. Like, yeah, essentially, like give us like a hypothetical. Like, what would be the difference between a comment that like might be like critical and what would be one that for you is like it's building hate towards people, or it's too far? What would you give an example?
When I said that comment, I'm not only thinking about one individual player, I'm more thinking of the brand as well, right? I think the brand of entirety, the entire stream being toxic and just being negative all the time and everything that's commentated out is almost negative. I think that's a bad brand to have, and I think it also turns people away from it. So I more think it's, as Rich also said, like guidelines, having some guidelines, follow these kind of things, and then they'll mostly solve itself, and it shouldn't be a big problem. Now, to the other thing Rich talked about, I think if you can make co-stream into superstars, like if you can make LS into a superstar, Dom into a superstar, and actually grow them, like Fortnite did with their players, I think the viewership would actually skyrocket. Like, for example, for me, I'm not going to watch other regions if Dom isn't streaming. I mostly just watch Dom's cast because I think it's the best way to do it for me. And often, then, it was only LCS or LEC casters. Often, I would see the cast, and I'd be like, I'm not going to watch this caster because I don't agree with what he says, and I think his cast is bad. So I think it's very important, and I think this will actually grow the scene as a whole.
I have some takes here that actually might go counter to Wickd here. So we'll see. This might be my first proper disagreement. Because the thing is, if you haven't noticed, I can disagree and have a totally different perspective. It's just how I weave it in. But I'll say straight up, I actually categorically disagree with some of his perspective. But I understand it in the perspective that you're coming from the player perspective. Mate. You know what it's like for you personally to maybe be affected, or a teammate to be affected by criticism on Reddit. Right. One thing I will say, and actually in saying this, I'm not saying this just as someone who's biased because I'm not a player, because this actually affects me directly, literally me, but I also can see from sort of a wider perspective that I have to be able to get over this, which is this. I did a whole video on this topic where essentially I can go both ways on this side. I can totally see how, as a content creator, for example, if people keep saying negative things about you or keep saying things that you think are untrue, or even if they're true, they're really mean that they say, it will absolutely impact your self-esteem, your mental health, of all these things, of course. It will. No one's impervious, no matter how tough they might seem on camera. It's getting into everyone on some level, right? It's one of the reasons why personally I think it's ridiculous when the angle people try to take against me and Richard Lewis, for example, is that we're thin-skinned. It's by definition, we are some of the most thick-skinned people to ever work in this entire industry. If anything, that just shows what happens. That, guess what? Yes, 1 million small pygmy spears will take down an elephant. 1 million of them. That's the point. It's not that one spear takes you down. It's that eventually you can overwhelm the beast, as it were. Now, my problem with this, right, is even as I say that, I also do think that players and content creators have to be responsible with how much they expose themselves to that. So an obvious example would be this. It's very different if I asked... So let's take Sven, for example, because he's obviously recently just been benched. I agree, I don't think he played badly, but his team didn't do well, right? So I'm sure he got some hate no matter what, right? Let's say he went and read some of the Reddit threads, which I already would say don't do, but let's say he wanted to do it. If he read those Reddit threads an entire week after MSI, when he's chilled out, he's maybe seen his girlfriend or something, he's had a few days to fucking decompress, maybe he's even watched a VOD and he knows some of the problems they had, he might then be able to look at some of the comments and laugh them off and go, who cares, or this guy doesn't know anything, or he's not. But I tell you what, if he reads that thread, the second he just exited the server, losing the game, it's going to have 10 times more emotional impact on him as a person, right? So one of the things I'm sort of getting to here is, right, imagine we are just fans of anything, right? A movie, a fucking another sport. There has to be somewhere we can have what, yes, on some level are going to be toxic fan discussions. For example, I'll use Rich's example. If we're fans of Arsenal and they're not the best team, there has to be somewhere that Arsenal fans can discuss who should be kicked out of the team or who they don't think is good enough. So unfortunately, even though we all grew up with it as an area we think of as just public discourse, I do consider Reddit and Twitter on some level, I call them the virtual barbershop, because if you don't know, in black communities in America, the barbershop is the place to talk about sports, because while you're getting your hair cut and while people are waiting, people just shoot the shit. They talk about, this guy's not as good as, I don't know, fucking Michael Jordan was, or this team needs to cut this guy. And the idea is it's just a vibe where, in that setting, if LeBron James actually walked in the back of the barbershop and we were all having that discussion, he's a fucking pussy, I think he just flops too much. Yeah, that would really hurt his feelings. But the question is, where do they have that discussion? And then B, LeBron James can't just live his whole life so that everything comes to a fucking halt because he walks in the room. People have to have their life as well. So on that angle, I kind of I sort of agree and I don't agree. I agree it is having an impact, and I wish in some utopia we were all aware of that and we didn't do it. But at the same time, I also do kind of feel like there has to be a space that fans can have those discussions. That's different from the co-streaming angle, obviously. I'm giving a more general take there, Wickd. What do you think about that?
So I think it's great for people to have the discussion. I have no problem with Reddit or Twitter and so on. I'm more thinking of the angle of a Riot-sponsored co-stream, right? Right. If it's a Riot-sponsored co-stream, then I think it should be toned down a tiny bit and not be overboard. And it's not like you can't say this player is terrible and he's playing badly, but it's just keep it within some limits, right? When it comes to Reddit, people should say whatever they want to say. Who cares? Who cares about what Reddit says anyway?
I had one other take on that though, which is like, it goes like this. This might sound weird, but I do feel like fans don't stop and think about this, and maybe even some other content creators haven't. Right, so I'll give you an example. Right, on any of my talk shows about League of Legends, you could literally make a bingo game, couldn't you? That at some point I'm going to say the words Reckless, Forgiven, Frog, like, you know all the fucking names. You all know the names. Now, what is one of the mad things that people do to me, right, to gaslight me, is they claim I'm just obsessed with all these players and I bring them up for no reason and with no relation. Now, anyone who's ever seen Twitter, social media, knows that that can't be true because people always comment on me commenting on those names. So what I'm bringing up here is, I actually think genuinely, so I'll give you a classic example, Wickd. I think a lot of people did get upset for where on Dom's core streams, obviously there are certain players he appeared to target. A classic one is Ryoma, obviously. The player who was the mid laner for 100 Thieves who just wasn't very good, unfortunately. Now, when he, as I say, people would say he targets him, like, you know, focuses on him, singles him out. If he just does badly, he's going to say he did really badly, whatever. I know what people are going to build it up as. What people don't acknowledge is this. In my opinion, genuinely, if the only time on Dom's impetus that conversation ever came up was at the beginning where he said, I disagree with this guy as a player, and then every now and then he just referenced, I don't think he did very good in mid lane. I'm not joking. I don't think there would be even half as many mentions. What happens is you get caught in a feedback loop as a content creator with your own fans and the general fan base. And as I say, it's a feedback loop. What they say about what you say will then actually influence and affect how you then address things in the future. So as I've always said, I actually didn't, by the way, personally dislike Reckless until something mad like 2017 or 2016, because I actually, to that point in time, didn't have any reason to. I just thought he was an overrated player. But because I thought he was an overrated player, fans would tell me all the time that I hate him, I'm lying, I'm making it all up, which then just means if I get any other piece of info that corroborates my position, I'm going to reference it because it's constantly in my face. They're bringing it up over and over again. So basically, as a core streamer, like, I would guess in that particular case, someone like Dom, what he's also responding to when he keeps signaling Ryoma out is what you don't see, essentially, which is every time he goes in with a thread that was about his last video, it's people having the debate of like, well, is he being too harsh? Or I think Ryoma needs more time, or, you know, he's from another... Like, that is actually feeding back into how you then respond, because we are all just like creatures of environment to some degree, you know, it is going to influence you. So I know, listen, none of that's an excuse, by the way. I also agree. Part of me wishes I could be some Buddhist ideal and, you know, only impart positivity in the world. But my problem is, like, just anthropologically, I think there's more going on there than people realise. Like, I don't really think a lot of the content creators are haters, put it out way. But I do think that really annoying fans can almost like lock you in some sort of fucked up game of chicken where you're just almost arguing against that fan, but it sounds like you're just targeting the player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's the same with me. Every time I bring up freezing or anything that LS have said, Rennick Tonic Gnar, it's instantly, oh my god, he said this about LS. And it's like, even if it's completely unrelated. Like sometimes I will say it directly about LS, right?
Yeah.
But often it's unrelated.
Fair enough. I just thought that was like one of those observations that I made that like people might not realise. Like, if you notice, what I tried to do, genuinely, is I tried to actually observe even my own life. Like, it was like a fucking David Attenborough documentary and just figure out like what's going on here. Like, what are the pressures? What are the inputs? What the impetus for doing something? Because I feel, what do you think on that overall, Rich? Because here's my problem. Like I say, part of me does think on the human level. Like, if I really met Ryoma in real life, I'd feel sorry for the guy. Yeah, he's getting hated on all the time. But then there's also a cynical part of me goes, listen, mate, this isn't like you're just working down McDonald's and we're all being a dick to you when you need to make a living. Like, you did choose to opt into like a high pressure sports environment where you get paid a king's ransom to be good at the game. Like, there's a part of me gets cynical as well. It's like, listen, if you can't stand the heat, get the fuck out of the kitchen. So where do you come down on this? And also I'll throw in as well, people know from my sense of humour, I have a very dark sense of humour. So even though I don't think that's always evil when you express it, I kind of do sort of like seeing people get flamed. I do it myself, obviously. So where do you come down on this? Because I think it's a complicated topic.
Because I think there's another aspect to it as well, which people don't understand, which is obviously you have the baggage, let's say, this was kind of the baggage of being a pro player, right? Which is you have to be able to deal with the social media and blah, 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 or that, you know, that's part and parcel of being a pro player. But I also think for the people who are, you know, putting the players down or whatever, they're also opting into something which isn't non-risk, right? And what I mean by that is if you put yourself out there and say, especially if it's, with someone who's perceived to be, very highly rated and you believe they're overrated or whatever, if you open your mouth on a stream or whatever the case is and give a completely conflicting opinion, which is perceived as negative, you're also putting yourself or your reputation on the line as well, right? Because you're basically endorsing a point of view, which is a negative point of view. And if it turns out to be wrong, like if there was some watershed moment, which, somehow magically showed that everything you said was complete horseshit, right? Like, I don't know, maybe you proclaimed this guy's so bad at mid, he's so bad at laning, he's never going to win a lane the whole season. And then he proceeds to dumpster every lane in unfavorable matchups. Then obviously you're, proved to be a fraud and look like an absolute idiot, right? So I think as well, if you're someone who is building up a reputation as a very good analyst for the game, I think you're entitled to give opinions if they are backed up in sound reasoning. The reasoning doesn't even have to be correct, or at least how you've arrived at your conclusion doesn't necessarily have to be correct. But as long as you're willing to give your strongly worded opinion and explain how you got there, then people are allowed to disagree with you or agree with you. I don't think there can be this kind of binary thing of you said a bad thing, that means you bad man, or vice versa. I think that basically all criticism can be seen as constructive if framed properly, right? And constructive criticism doesn't have to be, I have the solution to how this guy can improve as a player on an individual level. That might be impossible for you to do because you don't know the guy, right? But by you critiquing a mid laner's performance and saying, I believe that a better way to play this lane would be X, then, I believe that you are providing a service beyond, this is just someone shouting, negativity at a cloud. I think there's inherent value to that. And as in terms of like the player being upset about it or whatever, again, it's one of these things where, sometimes it is genuinely upsetting or unfair the situations that certain players get put in because of unfair narratives that were created about them.
Yes.
But and that will happen. But I think it's just one of those things which is kind of impossible to police. And so I would err on the side of, sure, you have your guidelines if you're officially associated with Riot about, trying not to swear every other second or whatever. And obviously don't bring up anything that could be perceived to be bigoted or discriminatory, whatever. But by and large, I think people should be allowed to say what they say. And I think if someone is just basically sat there just mouthing off about how they hate everyone and everyone's shit and how this guy sucks, and they're never really explaining it, they're just putting this person down, that guy will lose their audience pretty damn quickly, I would imagine. I think there'll be an element of correction that takes place regardless. And I think a great example of this, by the way, is LS, right? LS is constantly accused of going way too far and just shitting on players and blah, 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 or whatever. It's like, well, you motherfuckers still come back and, watch his analysis for 20 minutes afterwards, right? The same people who are writing those negative comments. So, and that's not me saying that because he has viewership, that means he must be correct. I'm just saying that I think by and large, if you're providing a service where you explain your ideas and you're sort of, being somewhat educational at the same time and saying why you think it's bad and you walk through your reasoning, then I don't think a negative opinion is necessarily all negative.
No, I agree with that. Like, I don't think any of the co-streamers right now are at a point where I'm like, this is way too far, right? I just think it's something you always have to keep in mind, that it can go too far and it can be bad. Like, one thing, I read a book recently about growing as a YouTuber and so on, and one thing that you can notice is you can build rituals about shitting on a player, for example. And that ritual is something that people come back to because they expect it from you every time. Okay. And that can actually grow your brand as well.
Oh, of course. I mean, by the way, in that scenario, like that's an example, like the Ryoma Dom example is a classic one. Everyone knows that exact example, that he's almost like billed as like the villain against the hero of Ryoma, if you're a fan of that player. So, and obviously I've played that role myself many times.
But ultimately, he's responsible for his own words as well, right? It's like, sure, there's this added element of like, if enough people say something, does it apply pressure on orgs and stuff? And yes, it does. And that's an unfortunate side effect. But at the same time, if Dom's just sat there saying unfounded nonsense about Ryoma day after day.
Basically, he said some sort of a comment along the lines of like every team needs like almost like a mother and a father figure like within the players. I think he listed himself and Ming, like the two veteran players in the team at that squad. Like he was seeing them fulfilling that role in the team. Now I took this to mean in the model of like mother and father, like basically you could use the obvious example of like good cop, bad cop. Like, there's like maybe the father figure is more like the disciplined guy, like driving people. Maybe if he's a veteran telling you, this is what it takes to be at the top, blah, 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 to the rookie type players. And then the mother angle would be the idea of the supportive person, the guy who also maybe is a veteran, but he's the one you go to tell like, oh, I'm having struggles with this. Or for example, the other guy shouted at me about something. Like, I could see like a value in kind of like the model he was setting up of like how you construct teams. Because I want to go to you first on this, Wickd, because obviously been a pro player for many years. One angle I do feel like a lot of people misunderstood with when they were making teams, I've seen this with many LEC teams actually, is they just make, in theory, the best players they can find to play the game. They don't even think about things like who would play what role socially in the team, or do I have a good balance of players, or for example, do I have too many rookies? Like, in my opinion, last year Mad Lions had too many rookies. They just had a whole load of players who'd never done it before. Some teams have too many veterans and don't have any rookie presence. What do you think of this? Like, as it, again, it doesn't have to be that specific example. It's like it's a conversation starter. What do you think of how you sort of make a team? Like, do you think it's important to have people who cover these elements? Does it not matter to you? What do you think?
So I think the way he phrased it is pretty interesting, because I don't think I've ever had the mother figure in a team, but father figure to some extent, I definitely have. Like the person that's motivating everyone and that actually makes people excel more. For example, last time we did a show, I talked about Snoopy and Ocelot hitting that perfectly. And I think this is really important. We also mentioned earlier about team chemistry and how important it is to actually have friendship and have a team. And I think it's one of the core things you need. So if you don't have that and you only have skilled players, which I've tried having before in teams as well, and we completely failed, it just doesn't work, because you can't get on the same page. You're not going to work towards the same goal in, how to phrase it, in a good way, right? Or in an excellent way.
What do you think, Rich?
So, again, obviously it was translated or whatever. I think a slightly better way of putting it would be, you need tough love and you need the carrot as well, right? And I think that... for example, something that obviously, someone like Forgiven gets a really bad rap for is like how he communicated with teammates or what have you. This is one of those situations where the immaturity aspect comes back into it, right? And what I mean by that is I actually think that Forgiven's style, though, I think even he, and that's saying something, would admit that, he could have dialed it back a bit.
Oh, of course.
His approach, I genuinely, I actually kind of liked how he talked to players on occasion. I think he gave them the home truths, the tough love that these people actually needed, and that because they were so immature, a lot of the time they just retreated into their shell and were able to play victim very easily of like, oh, daddy's hitting me kind of thing, verbally speaking, obviously. And I think that if there had been a very good sort of, let's say, mother figure, mediator, whatever, sort of more calming presence who basically digested what Forgiven did and then was able to put an arm around the shoulder of a player, take them to the side and saying, he just, he wants what's best for the team, blah, blah, blah. And there is some truth to what he's saying. I think that, on that team, for example, that could have been very successful. But I think the problem was that no one on the team was capable of digesting it in a way which was useful, because all they were seeing was the anger, and that this person, because his voice is elevated or whatever, that means he must have just lost his mind, and I'm not even really going to listen to what he says. I'm going to put my hands over my ears until the loud man stops shouting, and then it will all be okay again. But actually what this guy was saying, I won't say 10 times out of 10, but 8 times out of 10 was actually true. And this happened a lot with Vander, yes, where Vander definitely needed tough love. And this is one of these things where even a few months after, Vander was still very sort of negative towards Forgiven and that experience. But then reflecting a year on, talked about it in a completely different light and sort of made comments to the extent of I wish I kind of listened more, and actually was correct about what I was saying. And yeah, I did always do this and whatever. So I do think that there's truth to that sort of that quote. I don't necessarily think that you have to have those two figures. I think obviously the more mature people you have on a team, the better. But I also think that what's really important is that people have to be able to take tough love. And I think particularly in the League of Legends scene, very few people are good at taking negative criticism when it's given in anything other than a beautifully gentle way, a gentle package for them to digest. So yeah, I think that's a big issue. And again, this comes back to coaching and stuff like that. Like most of these coaches aren't capable of doing it either. They're not capable of navigating around. And what ends up happening is because the coach is, very often wanting to be like friendly with the players as well, and worried about what might happen. And if there are things that are going to go badly in game, who's going to get the blame? And obviously, if you have negative feelings towards someone, everyone immediately points a finger at Forgiven, right? As soon as anything goes wrong, oh, Forgiven, well, one of us is going to get kicked, and it's going to be really easy to pile on this guy because everyone agrees that Loud Man is mean, right? So I think that comes to the coach's responsibility as well. And I think very often coaches are too scared to actually, I don't want to say pile on players because that's, laying it too thick, but to give players tough love and to actually, sometimes you do need to present things in not necessarily an aggressive way, but a firm manner. And I think that's still severely lacking in the scene. So yeah, I think tough love is something that's missing for sure. And I guess, the yin or the yang to that yin as well would obviously be good in terms of what he's obviously talking about. But I don't think that's like some Exodia like level setup where it's like we have a mum and dad on our team. So, we like, I think, yeah, again, it's a translation, but I wouldn't phrase it in quite that way. But I think the overarching point I would agree with.
But to one of the points you thought about, right?
Yeah.
I think one thing people can say is Forgiven's career somewhat got screwed over because he didn't have any good coaches, because coaches didn't exist. Coaches didn't exist at that time, at least at a good level, right? I think if Forgiven with his skill and even attitude was in a team with an excellent coach, he could perform so much better and he could have been one of the best players in the world. But sadly, his attitude alone needed help from a supportive character, right? Or a good coach. And if he had that, I think he would have performed so much better. And we would probably still see him today.
Yeah, I mean, if the scene was like developed, let's just say like 20 years from now, and you had some like wily, seen it all, done it all, like 50-year-old bloke who was like, a more sort of authoritarian style figure, then I absolutely agree with that. I think you maybe could. I wouldn't specifically blame, certain things that went wrong with Forgiven on Prolly, because I think that one, esports was obviously very primitive at the time. And two, I do think Prolly had like very extreme strengths, which even Forgiven respected, and Forgiven doesn't respect that many people by default, So I think he actually was able to control Forgiven more than most, just because Forgiven had such an underlying respect for someone who could tell him things about the game that he didn't know, which obviously to him is like a crazy concept, right? But yeah, no, absolutely. Like, again, I mean, even now, right, however many years on, 6-7 years on, there's just very few people in the scene who would be capable of dealing with a Forgiven. In fact, if you told me, let's just say Forgiven was back at his apex, best AD carry in the West, he's going to be joining a new team, you put, any of us in charge of making decisions for that team, and you tell me, hire a coach that's going to deal with this guy, and I have to give you a name, I'm struggling to come up with someone who would have the package to deal with that. And again, that's, by the way, that's not a slight at Forgiven in this instance. That's a slight at how we deal. Right? Yeah. The pool of coaches. So.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And also, it wasn't a slight at Prolly. It was more like even early in his career, right? He didn't have anyone, and neither did I when I was a player. So it's like the entire scene when he was a pro, from at least the beginning of it, there was nobody that was good. Like I remember one of our coaches, the only thing he did was just bring us food and talk to us sometimes. That was literally the only thing he did. It was like a manager at best.
You had Veggie, and that was pretty much it in the like super early seasons in terms of people. I
mean, one of the things that Wickd says that ties into another thing I've often said in League is the problem is it's also this ties into people being immature and not understanding like the professional mindset that like a sportsman has. It's that in every sport you were coached from the time you were a little kid. Like there's no soccer player who goes, I don't think coaches do anything, because that would be like an alien concept. What they would say is they might think this coach doesn't do something, but they've been coached their whole lives. They know the value that they can be brought, and so as a result, I agree. The problem is that like if you take what Wicked's phrase and you just say if he'd been coached from day one as a pro, he'd obviously be a totally different player, wouldn't he? Like half his problem, I agree, is like he only got to Prolly like 2 years after he'd been in LEC essentially, and then even then you're talking about scenarios where he's taking splits off and he's on teams that sometimes are the smaller teams in terms of the money they spent. Yeah, there's a million factors. It's not as simple for fans who don't know that, like, oh, this guy could never have made it. He could. I agree with you though, Rich. The main problem Forgiven had could be summarised like this. It's like, that meme people love to say on the internet, like, you're not wrong, you're just an asshole. Like, that was his problem. He was right most of the time. It's just that, like, what he didn't understand was, like, the time and place to say something, tact, or as you say, everything can't come from you. Like, think about it, right? If I'm literally criticizing you for something that in the game affected me, it's going to become about you versus me, no matter how good a point I make. Whereas if I could obviously send that through like a teammate that wasn't involved, or you get along with it, the message is going to be received a lot easier, isn't it? It's obvious. I'll even say as well, by the way, I actually think that's an area that people romanticize sports figures in a way where they make it too simplistic. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but one of the things I hate about the way the American media follows people's stories is they genuinely make it that if you start winning and you're the champion, it's because you reflect all these great positive human qualities that you must have learned them. And if you lose, you're obviously a bad teammate and a bad human, and it goes like hand in hand. So I saw this happen literally when I was following the career of Kobe, right? In the years when he had teams that weren't very good, they barely made the playoffs, all they would emphasize was, this guy's a terrible teammate, that's why he doesn't have good enough teammates, because they don't want to play with him. Then when he started winning, right, they just made it like, look, in 2 years he learned how to be a teammate and how to be a great guy. Now the reason that doesn't make any sense, right, is if you're actually like a hardcore fan of the sport, you're not just following this media narrative. It was the other way around. Like, what actually happened was, in the same way as everyone watches that Last Dance documentary about Michael Jordan and they go, well, he was an asshole, but in a way that helped. It's like, no, the part you're missing is he was an asshole. And when he was just an asshole, it had a mega negative effect on lots of his teammates. And he was just really good individually. Then he got Scottie Pippen, who basically did exactly what we're talking about, was like the good cop. And his literal role was that. It was to take what you're saying, take all the sting out of it, if you basically like reaming your teammate out, and sort of deliver the good part to them and be a support network. That means they feel like, all right, I'm not being isolated. And basically what happened in Kobe's career was he got one of his old teammates, Derek Fisher, back, who did exactly the same thing. In fact, if people don't know, Derek Fisher a few years later became like the fucking like head of like the Players Association or something. That's how good this guy was at like representing players, talking. So what you need in that sense, that's why I brought the example, is you've got to balance those people out, because as we're pointing out with the Forgiven example, they can play a really valuable role. Like effectively what they're doing is like the kind of harsh criticism you'd hope a coach would be able to deliver. Just some coaches won't do it, because as you say, Rich, like the problem in the modern day as well is if you're a coach, you have to balance things like, if I criticise too many of the players and too many of them don't like it, I'm out of the team. If I criticise this player, maybe he leaves the team. Like, you can't always just think, is this the thing he needs to hear? You have to think, how is it going to be received and all the rest of it? And I will say, another thing people like Forgiven didn't understand is there were teams where there are people considered charismatic leaders, where some of them just didn't care how the worst player played in the team. Like, they'll just have him quietly cut in the off-season. Like, they don't need to go to him directly and go, look, bro, if you want to play on the team, you've got to do X, Y, Z, and I expect a higher standard. Like, some of them, in some ways, were more cynical and actually cared about their teammates less, I would argue. It's just the way they expressed it is not in a way that checked all the check marks of you're an arsehole. So there was no issues there. Because I agree, by the way, one thing I do think actually is, even to this day after all that everyone knows, the one thing I do think about Forgiven's career is, if no one knows, Young Buck hinted at this in my reflections, effectively Forgiven has been kicked from every team he was ever on in the LEC. Like, if not like out overtly, they just didn't offer him a contract, so they effectively said, we don't want you. Now the reason for that, by the way, is not ever that he was the worst player, and it's not even that he was always so untenable as a teammate. It's that, like you were saying, Rich, he just always put himself in the crosshairs at every possible instance. And so the obvious thing everyone would think when it like something needs to change, the answer just springs to mind of like, why don't we get rid of the guy shouting at us all the time? Like, It's just the obvious thing you're going to think, isn't it? Well, even though, by the way, there was another famous pattern that a lot of people won't know, and this is real, except for Schalke. Schalke is the only team that excluded from this pattern. Every team Forgiven left was way worse than XSplit. That's a fact. You can go and look it up. They never, in fact, except for Schalke, none of them ever even achieved the same level of height that they were at with Forgiven. Now that tells me it can't just be that this guy was an arsehole, you know.
Well, what I would say on the Schalke thing as well. I mean, I won't say too much. Like, obviously, I have quite a lot of insight onto that team, but the Schalke immediately getting better had nothing to do with playing with a different AD carry in the sense of like, we're upgrading it in this position at all or whatever. It wasn't even like, oh, things just click better because this guy does things that, Forgiven didn't do, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It was literally because some players went so into their shell around Forgiven, they just became mutes. And they just basically they were mini protesting essentially. So this idea that it's like, because I remember, I heard arguments and stuff when, which I yeah, again, I didn't want to say like too much publicly or whatever when people said, oh, and immediately the next game they beat G2, like, Forgiven can never say anything, because this was all such nonsense. Essentially, in the same way that you can say that Forgiven came out and gave kind of like an ultimatum, right? At least publicly. He's like, oh, I had this ultimatum, it wasn't accepted, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, that's what the players did. They basically refused to play until he was gone. So this idea that Schalke like upticked because Inax just brought like this amazing calmness and was doing all these things. Absolute nonsense. Like, that's true by extension in the sense that you remove the angry man, so it's more calm, right? Addition by subtraction.
Sure.
But basically, players just decided to protest and go mute and not really do anything or really play the game. That's basically what happened. And fuck it, basically support a mid, just refuse to play the game, essentially.
By the way, that is effectively, if people don't know, I can tie this back into the coaching angle. There's another reason why coaches are very careful or they feel like they're on eggshells in league about criticising players, because here's the fact a fan never thinks about. You know, every fan wants the coach to be like Jose Mourinho, be like, I have complete control, I'm deciding this, and I'm live or die off it. What they forget is this: the coach can never literally impact the game directly. He always needs someone else to do what he is asking in order for his vision to even be tested. So the ultimate way that any player can fuck you is just sabotage what you ask. And everyone knows, if you've ever been in the scene, there are players who they will say, yeah, all right, coach, I'll try it if you say so, but they'll just go in the game thinking in the back of their mind, this doesn't fucking work, this is going to fail. And when it fails, they'll have to see that he was wrong, and they'll just sort of half-arse it in the game, a pick, a matchup, a way they play around someone, and effectively, no joke, they're waiting for the game to be lost. They're going to come out of a game, because remember, every fan's going to think they want to win every game. They're going to come out of the game that's lost, and they're going to try and make it a whole thing of like, didn't I tell you? Look, it just doesn't work. Like, that could be as simple as a champion pick, could be which lane you play around is a classic one. Like, if some AD carry, like if it's Piglet or someone they want to be played through 24/7, they're just going to pick the one game they play Sivir and just feed the game and be like, look, I needed the jungler. Like, it's too easy to do that. So that's one area I do actually have sympathy for coaches and teammates. It's like, it's easy as a fan to think, just speak up and say what you think. It's like, saying what you think will get you fucking fired very quickly in an industry that's about feelings and what people's perception of you is, mate.
But I think that's a big problem, right? I think it's very, very important we get more stability. And I think it's even a player problem right now. Players are being replaced way too quickly, and they aren't really truly being tested in a team. And it's the same with coaches, right? You don't build up any structure at all. It's just like, yo, you guys are playing together before, Richard, that you're doing.
Said what? Sorry, can you say?
Having one player in a specific role, like don't have like 4 top laners from Europe.
Oh, okay.
Because you obviously made that argument.
So kind of basically, I will potentially represent more than one player in the same role if they're not at remotely similar parts of their career, right? Because my issue is, and obviously everyone's definition of like where on the spectrum conflict of interest lies, like, is going to be different. But for me, if you're at the point where you're hypothetically could be competing for the same contracts, then that to me is too far. So I won't represent I couldn't represent like Jankos and Selfmade, right? I just wouldn't do it. But for example, if I might represent Jankos, like super sought after, super experienced, world-class jungler, and then a jungler in the ERLs, or someone who's having like their first split in LEC on like a bottom tier team, because to me those guys aren't actually competing with each other, at least not on a business level, right? Only in the Rift. So yeah, that's generally my philosophy right now. You can say it's like a bit flaky, or the parameters aren't like super hard and fast, I guess. But yeah, that's how I operate.
But coming from a player's perspective, one thing I'm thinking, is there any way the players can actually know if their agent is representing a lot of different people that are actually out for the same job? Or is there no way for that?
Yeah, so this is something that I think I talked about with Thorin before, where I would personally be in favor, and this has actually been discussed by Riot, of having a database where you can see who represents who. Because, for example, if you come to me as a top laner and you say, hey, I need an agent, but I'm worried that I won't be like given top priority, you don't have to say my word for it. You can just look at the database and see, hey, what the fuck? This guy represents fucking Odo, Alfari, like whoever else would be like, fuck that, I'm not doing that. So that's what I'm personally in favor of. Like, I'd be more than happy if they went ahead and did that. Because as I said, I mean, there are agents in the scene who are just happily representing like 5 AD carries, all of a similar caliber, etc. So yeah, that's like my personal philosophy. Like, I only really have 2 rules. That's one of them. And the other one is I'll only represent people that I believe in and get along with, and that I think, are actually workable with. But yeah.
Yeah, I
One
think
thing
that's
go on.
that really important. Like, I actually think it's super important because as a player, you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes, and a lot of players don't even spend any time on knowing that, right? So often they'll just sign a contract or sign with somebody, and they're gonna get screwed over.
One thing I want to ask, I have like a brief topic on this I want to ask about, is like in the concept of like what an agent does right now in League of Legends. Obviously, one of the problems, and I've experienced this, I can give an analogy for my own work as a content creator, because if people don't know, a number of years ago, I was represented by what is literally one of the biggest agencies in the entire world, because it was one that was bought when they were an esports agency by a much bigger like Hollywood agency, basically. Like, you would put it this way, people who know agencies in Hollywood would know the name if I said it, but I won't say it for the sake of, fucking being polite or whatever. And basically, the problem I ran into with them, Rich, was when they would go and try and make sponsorship deals for me, they didn't essentially like say, right, well, look, obviously we've got to act in your interest, but also in our interest. Effectively, they told me they were acting in my interest, but they only pretty much exclusively acted in their own interest. So as in, the examples I would give would be, I found out there were times where someone might have done a deal with me for, say, $5,000 a month, but because their percentage of that would have been $500, or $1,000, depending on what the deal I had with them was, their perspective was they would essentially just filter those deals out and not tell me about them. Like, they would say something like, they would just tell me something that maybe wasn't totally untrue, but like maybe they said to the guy, we're looking more for a deal in the 10,000 range because they think, 1,000, 2,000 is a better amount to make for them. And so what they would tell me is they would just use a euphemism like, he wasn't really that interested, or he wasn't serious. But then I would find out like a year later, like, what do you mean you wanted to sponsor me for this much? Like, they told me you weren't interested. And I would be like, what the fuck? So then basically I had to, no joke, I fired these people because I found that like their main like motivating factor was what their percentage cut would be. And the problem with that obviously is, look, I understand they have to make money. I understand that's why, by the way, you have multiple people you represent. But at the end of the day, the first thing ultimately should be the idea that you do represent me, as in you are trying to get the deals I want, and then after the fact, obviously then you make the deal make sense for everyone and it has to be worth your time. I get all that. So essentially what I'm asking is this. A lot of people are going to say, Rich, it's like conflict of interest. I understand on one level why some people don't think conflict of interest is a big deal. It's because to make there be none is very difficult. And it sometimes means that like in this particular case, if there really was only one agent per good European top laner, there'd be a fucking lot of agents, way more than there are now, obviously. And so people who are agents will say like, well, right now in the industry, can we operate like that? Can it, as a business, don't we need to make our margin? How would you sort of argue against it? Because I'm sort of being a bit idealistic, but I also think if we don't have these standards, I don't think you can ever make people go through. I think people will just use these loopholes forever, essentially. So what would you say to that angle? Because I see a lot of the, I think, sort of unethical behaviour, but people will claim they have to do it sort of to make it right now. What would you say?
So the first thing I would say is anyone who tries to come to me with an argument of like, oh, well, there's so few good people who are actually capable of like arguing on the players who are qualified or whatever, so I feel I have to do it for X amount of players. I would say that that's categorically not true, because I've already seen examples where the exact thing I'm talking about has happened, right? Where it's literally two of the three best players in a position are literally competing for the same couple of contracts. And the agent essentially is juggling, oh, well, I feel like this team wants this guy more, so I'm going to try and push harder in this area. And even though this would be the second option for, my other client, I'm going to push them there. I'm not saying that's exactly what was said, but there's no way that could have been avoided, right? Because it's literally impossible for you to act in the best interest of both clients if they're both competing for the same two contracts. Or let's make it even more simple. Let's say there's just one contract up for grabs on the best team in Europe, right? And you have two of the best three players in that position. It is literally impossible for you to be, void of conflict. It's impossible. One person is going to have to lose out, and you're going to see at a certain point who's more likely to get the job. So you're then going to all in on that guy, and you're going to feed the other guy some nonsense about how, well, you never really had a chance. Whereas if someone else was representing player B, then they could go all ham and say, okay, maybe it's only a slim chance, but I'm going to do my absolute best to try and push you through that door. Why, if I represent both, am I going to waste time trying to push through the guy who's less likely when I get the same money anyway, right? Most likely, or something similar, because as long as one of my two guys get signed, I'm happy. I've done my shtick. But for your player B, who's going to get thrown by the wayside, he got nothing. In fact, he lost something, right? Potentially. So Yeah, it's impossible to anyone who claims there's not a conflict of interest. It's just flat out lying. It's impossible to represent players in the same position of a similar caliber and not have conflict of interest. It's absolutely impossible. And even if we stretch the parameters and say all 10 teams want both players, you're still conflicted. Unless they both come to you and say, oh, it's really lucky because actually I have no interest in this team and all my interest in this team, and the other guy has a perfectly matched answer, right, which fits in there. Like, other than these niche outlier scenarios, there is always going to be a conflict of interest. So I think it's an absolute nonsense. What I would say is if you're doing, something more similar to what I do, the sort of situation you spoke about with a sponsor is somewhat mitigated because, for example, let's just say I'm representing 5 players all in different positions and I'm looking for teams for them, every off season or whatever. I have an inherent interest to not just get them a deal which is financially good, because obviously the more money they make, the more money I make, but also I need to put them in a position to succeed if I want this to be remotely long term, right? So I'm not just going to say, okay, well, Team X is offering like $1 million, but they're going to be a bottom feeder 10th place team, but I really want you to go there, right? I mean, maybe that would be the case because maybe I feel like this player is really overrated and maybe I'll have a, frank conversation like, come on, bro, you've been a pro for 12 years now. Your hands aren't really working how they used to or whatever, in a nice way where he gets to consider his options. But maybe in some instance that would be a better choice for him, right? But by and large, what I mean is I am motivated to the exact same degree of money and success as they are. In the sense that if I put them in a position to win, but they take 30% less money, that guy's probably going to have a better contract either with the same team or a different team on a winning team next time as well. But if I put a really promising player in a terrible position where he's going to make loads of money, but most likely get shunted out of the league immediately, I've screwed both of us over, right? Not just myself. Maybe someone will view it very short-sighted and say, well, as long as I get my quick payoff and not worry about it. But really, if you're being smart, if you're in this for the long game, your interests should align more or less with the player in that scenario. But as I said, as soon as you start representing a whole host of people who play the same position of a similar ilk, to me, it all goes to shit. And there's no way you can say with a straight face that you're not going to be conflicted in certain situations.
By the way, you mainly represent people in League of Legends, right? You don't represent any CSGO people, do you?
No, like at the moment, I only represent influencers in League of Legends.
Fair enough. Yeah. But basically, like, another concern I have, which is tangential to this, is also when I hear these stories, so we can tie this back to the whole Sven thing early on of the idea of, like, are you trapped in contract prison, etc. Like, that's a separate topic, the concept of contract prison, but we could have that as a whole discussion on another show sometime. But the idea that essentially you've signed a contract that's too long, and within the contract, maybe it wasn't beneficial that it was 3 years or 2 years, maybe for you should have done a 1 year and then seen where you were at for both parties, Right? One concern I have is, I do feel like that's an area where, even though I agree with you in theory, the agent that's actually shrewd about even his own personal long-term future should want the players to be on the right team and the right length of contract because it gets him the future contract as well. Sadly, we are in esports and there are a lot of grifters who were here for 1 minute and they might be gone in 2 years. I don't think some of them think that long-term. So a concern I have is, I personally do think a lot of players are getting locked into really long contracts, which they don't understand the impetus or the impact of, rather, because the agent just thinks to themselves, like, if people don't know, in the modern day, some agents either get literally like an upfront fee or they get like a percentage of the salary. So that's even a way of, cynically as an agent, just locking some income for some years. Like, the example I would give you, so I asked if you're in CSGO, is no one in CSGO batted an eye when this happened, but the player that was voted by the main community website, HLTV.org, the player of the year for the last 2 years was the young French prodigy Ziwu, right? A guy who wasn't even a pro player until the year he began winning player of the year in 2019. So obviously, like, one of the craziest, like, basically, if you don't follow CSGO, it's like when Lionel Messi came along. He was just instantly, like, pretty much the best. You can just tell they're going to be the best, and they're on a team that's very good, right? Here's the issue. After, I think it was towards the end of last year, which was the second year he won player of the year, it was just announced, like, almost as, like, a small story, like, by the way, he just signed a 5-year contract with the team. Now, as an outsider, right, this is how you know that our system is fucked. Because in theory, signing the max length contract, if you are the best player, if it was a good thing, would be an overwhelmingly good thing. It would be like being it'd be like signing for PSG and getting a deal for like $100 million. The problem is, we all know in esports that actually almost certainly will probably fuck him at some point down the line. Either he will be in contract prison with an enormous buyout and a lowered salary, or, for example, the obvious one that I think he was very short-sighted with whoever was supporting him is, what if in 3 years you are still the best player, but now you're in a deal that's worth way less? The Bjergsen scenario, if people don't know, where TSM got to like have a way lower payroll while having the best player in the LCS for a few years. So what would you say to that angle? Because that's one of the concerns I do have, where I feel like the incentive can like misalign sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors that come into it. I mean, as an example, if I was representing a player who I've been representing for like 7 years, and as I said, maybe at the end of their contract, longer contracts start to look more appealing with guaranteed payments or whatever, because obviously, if the guy's winding down or whatever. But even in a situation like that, I would have a talk with the guy and try and ascertain where he is. And even if he's completely deluded about where his current ability stands, if he tells me like, I want to play like on as competitive teams as possible for as long as possible, ultimately I'm going to give him complete agency to do that, right? Like, I'm not going to be someone who will say, take the money, dude, you're washed, like, let's do it. But in terms of like avoiding malpractice with agents who will, lock people in like ZywOo did or like ZywOo was or whatever, I mean, it's basically impossible. Once that person's agreed contractually that you're his representation, unfortunately, it's one of these things where it's like you hire someone because they have expertise in an area that you simply don't, that you're not comfortable with. But by definition, almost, you don't actually have the knowledge to even know if this is a good hire, because these are concepts you don't understand, right? So it's a very difficult paradox to be in. And with something like ZywOo, with the speed that esports moves in, even if you look at the numbers now and you're like, wow, in his second year he's going to be like the highest paid player in the world, maybe that plateaus a bit over the next few years, and who knows, Counter-Strike, if it went through like a fresh boon or something, maybe he'd have like a tier 2 salary in his fourth year or something, right? So yeah, I think generally speaking, if you have a player on the up and up, generally you want short-term contracts, right? Generally you don't want things to be contingent on buyout. You want short-term contracts as possible, unless you think unless you've done something like, for example, with G2, where everyone is a top player in the position and you all get round a table and you say, guys, let's run this back for the next 2 years. Like, I think we're all willing to like commit to the next 2 years if we all stay together. And that's kind of like a collective, not even like collective bargaining, but you're all in the same spot. You're not going to get fucked over by one guy leaving, most likely, or something like that.
Yes.
There are instances where it makes sense, even if you're at the top of your game. But yeah, generally, if someone is being overvalued, obviously the agent is probably going to want to push for like more guaranteed salary over time. But generally, if someone's trending up, like the ZywOo one, I mean, it's one of those things where you can make an argument that regardless of what the money is, unless it's something absolutely astronomically stupid, that any deal that's 5 years is bad for him. Because you simply don't know what the scene's going to look like. You don't know what the organization or how much support he's going to get in terms of like refreshing the lineup or whatever needs to be done is going to get. And if this guy at any point said to his agent, something that's really important to me is always being competitive, always competing with the top teams, regardless of what the money was, it's a bad deal. Because there's no way you can know that in esports. There's no way you can know that. Look at Olofmeister, right? You might think, oh, I'm signing with this team. They've got the current best player in the world in Olofmeister. Like, I feel very comfortable locking, this down for 5 years. Guy has wrist problems a year later, and now he's like an also ran, right? So yeah, it's almost always going to be a bad situation if you're like trending heavily upwards to have a really long contract.
I also think an angle is important to hit is it's not all about the money, right? Like, some players are okay just being well off or being decently off, and if they get enough money to that, then their primary focus is only to win, and the only thing they care about is winning, right? Most players I've actually played with have not really given a fuck about the money. They haven't cared at all. I think there's only been, from when I was in my prime, 3 or 4 players in all the teams I've been in that actually cared about money, and the rest only wanted to win, and that's the only thing they cared about.
You have to keep in mind that the money was like a bit different as well, like back then.
True.
So
obviously, right? But like, if you're being paid, let's say 2 or 3 millions, then maybe you don't care about having more money than that, right? Like, some people are satisfied having that amount of money because it's a lot of money.
Yeah, sure. I will say, by the way, just to give actually a sports example, because I'll tie it back in again if people are following the basketball theme. If a part, actually, I think most people didn't seem to understand in that Last Dance documentary, because unfortunately they didn't actually explain the Michael Jordan side very well. Both Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen literally managed to get underpaid for a number of the championships they won, because they both stupidly locked in for really long deals. One of them, the Scottie Pippen one, is really outrageous, because he essentially did it because he just wanted money like right that moment, because he came from a very poor background and he wanted to just literally take care of his family, like buy his mum a house and, you know, his cousins. So he literally locked into a deal where, this is a bad sign, by the way, guys. The owner himself was telling him, I would suggest you don't take this deal. Like, the market is literally like growing. And the problem was they both locked into deals, which at the time of signing the deal were fine. But then the problem was, like, free agency basically became huge, like, in the years following. And then the market literally just like almost exponentially grew. And so as a result, the famous stat was, like, by the end of like their championship runs, I think Pippen was paid like, you know, fucking like 90th in the entire NBA when he was effectively like the second best player on the best team. So that's just an example how even in sports that can happen. Like, you have to basically, you're not just looking at your team you're joining and your deal, you are asking relative to the whole market, what will it be? And so obviously in cases like in esports games, you've seen the last 4 or 5 years, some games have had a ridiculous uptick where if you thought like it might just get 10% better next year, you were wrong and you could be massively underpaid, as this example points out. Yeah, of course. This video was kindly supported by Eddie, Kris with a K, Lager15, Pronogo, Shenlong, Zachary Carter, Adam Ochs, Alexander Rao, Andreas Crockneys, Animosity, Dean Tanglis, ErikHillestad, Hades, Jdubs, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Tobias Bernasconi, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks going out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Want to suggest topics or guests for my shows? Want to ask me questions in my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers? Who are the upcoming guests? Maybe you want to be part of one of those discussions I do where we nerd out. Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrolluminati today by using the Patreon link in the description box below.